And recording. So thanks for the afternoon, everyone. So we're working through with a little break between now and 4 o'clock, unless we get through early.
Okay.
If you're still going, I do need to. I'm on a hard stop at 4 o'clock, so I will be leaving regardless. So that's no disrespect to anyone.
No.
Yes, we're back. Rates capping, excellent.
Rates capping. Well, rates target model.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks. Over to you.
Right. So this is one that has. So this has the submissions due on the 4th of February. So this is the first one. This is one where they have provided also a kind of draft, a discussion paper, and originally we weren't included in the consultation, so the consultation was targeted and they went to specific groups like LGNZ and Taituara, but they didn't go to councils directly. LGNZ and Taituara basically just sent all the materials to councils and said, can you give us some feedback? And then DIA decided to just open it up to councils. So, yeah. Originally all we had was the letter that had gone to LGNZ about the proposal with the proposed formula, and then I think this was the one that on Christmas Eve they dropped all of the cabinet papers, briefing papers, regulatory impact statements, so which I must confess I have read, but not been able to process all the detail of those yet in terms of how it might, well, to be fair, those papers go through a journey with it. Staff obviously went on with ministers, where the ministers at various points in the process redirected them in certain directions. So the main thing I took away from reading all the papers was that staff seemed to have a view that then changed over time based on the feedback they were getting from the ministers. So, but there is some useful information there in terms of the background about how the rates capping system has worked in other jurisdictions, or more precisely how it doesn't seem to have worked well in other jurisdictions. So what they are proposing is that, what they're proposing is a band. So essentially a band that has a lower limit and an upper limit. So what that means is that rate increases would have to be above the lower limit and below the upper limit. So the idea of that is that the lower limit should represent the minimum that councils should be increasing their spending by to respond to growth in the economy in which they operate and growth in the economy they operate in via the CPI, essentially. So it's about inflation. So making sure that as costs increase, council spending doesn't stay the same. So the upper bound is intended to align with economic growth. So it's representative of, as economies grow, there's an expectation from communities that councils invest in more and better infrastructure. So that's the upper limit. So the implication from reading this, the consultation materials, the briefing materials, and from going to the webinar before Christmas, which I think was open to all elected members, so I'm not sure how many of you went to it, but there is a recording of it if you want to watch it. The implication is that the range would be calculated individually for individual either regions or specific councils. So it's while I've indicated a target range is 2 to 4%, what they're saying is that's indicative if you look at the factors they're considering on average across New Zealand, but the implication is that would be calculated specifically for each district. So each district might have a different range, which depends on local economic factors. The model is based on, first of all, it's important to note that this would relate to all rates, so, at targeted rates, at general rates, but it's only applied at the aggregate level, so it doesn't get applied down at the individual ward or targeted rate area level. It's done only at an aggregate level, and it doesn't apply to water charges because water charges will be outside of the system by the time we get to that. So and water charges won't be subject to a similar rule. They've got an entirely different economic regulatory regime, which is intended to ensure that their spending is appropriate. It also doesn't apply to non-rates revenue sources. So any other revenue other than rates, this doesn't apply to. It is intended to be considered from the 1st of July 2027, which is that DIA and the Commerce Commission will expect that we are looking at this from year one of our LTP, but we're not strictly going to be regulated to fall within that range until 1st of July 2029, which is year 3 of the LTP. So years 3 to 10 in the LTP will need to reflect this, but years 1 and 2 don't have to, but there will be monitoring from DIA that would, in relation to that. So there's an expectation that we apply it from the beginning of the LTP. Now, there's a few things to think about with the model. It assumes a steady state, so it's based on a world where there is no infrastructure deficit. So not New Zealand. And so that obviously provides some complications for us thinking through it and working through it. And I would anticipate is something that everybody's going to be commenting on in their submissions, and is one of the points that we've thought is worth highlighting. And so they have identified a variation process where we'll be able to apply to the regulator to ask for a variation outside of the identified band. And there's 2 situations where that would apply. One is for emergency, unforeseen, unpredictable situations, which I think everybody would expect to be in there. That's supposed to be a fast process. It wouldn't get tied up in the usual bureaucracy. The second situation is where we need to raise revenue for particular projects outside of extreme circumstances. No detail other than, for example, large-scale infrastructure projects. Okay, so a lot of the projects that we might have in our program. And the intention is that the consultation with the regulator occurs before we then consult on our LTP. However, there's a bit of a weird loop in there where part of the justification that the regulator would expect to see is that communities support rates being spent on that thing. And so there is a bit of a loop there that I think deserves some more thought from their perspective in terms of how you line those up. And they seem to have taken learnings from the New South Wales process in that they envision that this is not an onerous, time-consuming bureaucratic process. They are talking about it being a process that is easier to work in with the LTP timeframes, because their initial work was based on the New South Wales model, which has been in place since the 70s, which has had a parliamentary inquiry last year, which found it to be wholly unsuccessful and has resulted in significant infrastructure deficits. So one of the learnings from, I think, of the 128 councils in New South Wales, 127 of them routinely use the variation process. So, yeah. So in terms of actually, so they've got those 2 variation processes. And they have included this formula. So on the second page of the of the A3, I've got it in slides. Nope. Okay, so we'll just look at that though. They've provided this formula about how they calculate the target rates band, and it's a little bit of a mystery to us in terms of actually how you would use this to both set the band and to calculate our rates increase. So the part that I talked about at the beginning about the minimum being inflation, the maximum being attached to economic growth, that doesn't seem unreasonable, illogical. It doesn't seem illogical. But then they layer in this capital expenditure, and this is how you calculate capital expenditure. And they talk about capital expenditure being made up of depreciation, quality of infrastructure, population growth, divided by average population. So that's the bit where when we then tried to do a calculation to say, well, what would this look like for us? The top half, the minimum, maximum, using those 2 measures. Benji Patterson had a look at that for us, and he identified that a range from 2 to I think 4.8 per capita was what looked reasonable. well, what that kind of puts out. But the capital expenditure part of this, he was also a bit bemused about what numbers you would put in this in order to calculate this and how it works in the calculation. So they talk about this being a per capita measure, but then in some parts in the supporting documentation, they go per capita / per rating unit. Those are obviously two quite different things, and if you're spreading your increased expenditure that is required over rating units versus population, you get quite a different answer. So that also needs some thinking about. That's one of the areas that I think is probably worth submitting on in terms of getting more clarity on actually how this would apply in reality to calculate what the target is and how they're expecting that we target, that we calculate the rates increases.
Okay, when we had a session with DIA on this,
yep.
So the formula doesn't actually, this was the last time we spoke, it didn't actually have a proper mathematical formula behind it. It was expressed much more as a formula of principles, which is wonderful until you try and actually use it.
Exactly.
So I think, I think that's sort of the biggest challenge, is that we don't know, and arguably they didn't know at the time what would actually be spat out of something if you could work out a formula to do that. So it's certainly something that we should be really, and the whole of local government should be very, very forceful on in terms of saying, well, you need to show us what this is going to look like if this is going to be the model, and notwithstanding the more philosophical things about the target band, but then also having to get community buy-in. So, and if we go back to the previous conversation around the RMA and the requirements to basically meet fast track, meet the MPS, you can't use infrastructure to stop zoning. You're still going to be in a situation where even if you have community consultation, you will have communities that might be saying no, but you'll have a piece of legislation that says you must. So there are a whole lot of inherent, as we said right at the outset this morning, there's a whole lot of inherent conflicts in the various elements of these multi-system changes that are underway.
I was going to say, because this feels like a really easy political movement, because it sounds simple, and in the real nuance of going, holy shit, this is actually way harder than we thought. Is it worth in the submission being a little degrading, going like, this is what you say, but then also want us to do landscape schedules. This is what we say around growth, but then you're also not funding the deficit. This is financing, but you haven't created finance revenues. Just as like a different tone to go, you know what, like we get it, this one sucks. How can we have more?
And we've, Campbell's been having conversations, for example, well, hopefully you now have a conversation with Dave around how does this align to where the RMA or the national planning framework is changing. So for that very reason, they don't align. The other thing, and John and I were in the room, I think, when they spoke to us from New South Wales, was that what had really happened is, despite the fact that they say that this is easy to do, it hasn't proven to be easy to do in New South Wales. So councils have hung on, avoided doing it. So when they have done it, they've usually come up with whacking great massive increases of 74% rates increases, because they've spent almost a decade trying to avoid having to engage with the system. So, and nobody credits them for doing that. They simply see the 74% and it's it's all on, and largely those councils get they don't become councillors anymore.
They get blamed for something that they had little control of.
Well, arguably they had some control of it, but yes, I mean, the process is, again, sets itself up. Or certainly the New South Wales examples, and the example we had from the council that was involved, that's exactly what happened. They ended up with this, they waited, they had a crisis, they had a 74% when they modelled a rates rise, and all the council got turfed out at the next election.
It happened, exactly the same happened when I was working in the UK. Doncaster went for a zero rate rise. They essentially declared bankruptcy several years later, and commissioners were brought in. Same things happened in the last 18 months in the UK, where Reform party candidates have taken control of councils, zero rate rises, capped rates for council taxes, and it failed almost immediately. So it's not being what was the term used?
Oh, I don't know.
Negative. But it's just being realistic,
Yeah.
isn't it?
No, but yeah, and I think in the same respect, it's like we have a lot of time spent on these reforms trying to navigate it. This just feels like something that is so ridiculous and also vulnerable to being changed in the new government anyway. And like from our perspective, and obviously it's in detail, harder to sell politically, but in the same respect, don't want to spend too much time just bringing up really big, obvious points. These are just massive systemic issues.
So one of the interesting things about this, though, is all of those points are in the briefing papers that ministers have been provided. So there have been independent reviews of what happened in New South Wales, which clearly showed the model didn't work and the flaws with it and why it didn't work. And the officials were not even asked to go and look at they were asked to look at other models. So what they did was a desktop exercise looking at other Australian models, and then came up with a design for something totally bespoke for us. That isn't like what they're using there. So I think there is an element of things that clearly haven't worked in other jurisdictions where that advice has already been given to ministers by government agencies directly. The value of us kind of reiterating that or focusing on how this plays out in reality for us, because they haven't had that advice. They've had the technical advice in terms of other jurisdictions, but the perspective of what it means on the ground is what they haven't seen. Because they haven't had any local government involved in any of, they had a rates capping working group with central agencies with a subset of ministers. No one from local government was part of that. So they haven't had that perspective from, on the ground.
So this calculation though, does that actually give us a loophole if we're going to look at it a different way and say we'll come up with whatever rates we need? Yes, we'll be within the band, and then we'll just backfill whatever we need through that CapEx calculation because the assumptions are so.
Well, the CapEx calculation, because it's a formula of principles, is essentially the way it's presented here is how they set the target. So I'm not sure if that.
Like I said, we don't know what the inputs are, so we
No,
make those up.
not
come
yet.
up with whatever rates we need.
Yes, but they will get more specific on that because it has to be regulated.
In your discussions with them, is there are all these top line references to inflation? Well, there are lots of different inflations. And this is CPI, cost of eggs, cigarettes, petrol. And then there's PPI, which is a lot closer to our inflation. And then there's our inflation, which is asphalt, cement, steel, other stuff, which actually has accreted at a lot faster level. So all these like knee-jerk reaction, references to inflation are frankly inaccurate. Was there any acknowledgement of that?
Yeah.
That there is such a thing as council inflation?
Yes, and they claim that they're using the council relevant metrics for inflation. However, I don't think that they're using it quite at the level that we'd expect. So the New South Wales example, actually, they've just changed their calculation there, and they use a specific measure of roading and transport related costs. Because that is the majority of the spend of councils. So, and that's something that I think we should reiterate, because it's not clear in this, but when you talk to the staff, they're like, oh yeah, obviously it's not relevant to use the cost of eggs. It is the CPI has a whole lot of different ways of measuring different sectors within it, and they say they're using the subset that relates to council services. But if it relates to council services and not council infrastructure, then that's still a different
But that
thing.
would go into the depreciation calculation, wouldn't it? Because the calculation doesn't include inflation for CapEx.
No, sorry, it's the minimum.
Yeah.
The minimum of the band is basically tagged to inflation.
Oh, sorry, got it, I think.
So,
Operating expenditure, but capital expenditure is different.
I've listened to Chris
Yes,
talk
doesn't make
about
sense.
this. So one of the arguments is the opposite of that supply side economics, that because local authorities are able to increase their rates as much as they like, this is view, which he thinks they do. Therefore, all of those commodity prices rise to meet what can be paid. So they're saying reduce the amount that can be paid, and then inflation will reduce on those. Now, most of those commodities are actually international products. So that theory is only that.
Well, it's also some of them are monopolised in terms of like other aspects, which we could look into as an inquisition to lower the cost of infrastructure. But I guess this is a different way of doing it.
It is, but
Yeah, so the briefing papers actually talk about both the inflationary costs of building new roads and bridges has been a real increase, and then about the inflationary impact of rates. And it doesn't talk about how you reconcile those or how those are both part of a system. It just uses them both as throwaway comments in different
the
contexts.
assumption again is that if council rates reduce, then overall,
Inflation reduce.
Reduce, then overall inflation. Again, that's the theory.
So one of the other key things I thought was it seemed lost in their analysis was that in the New South Wales example, which is really it seemed to be the only one where there was a core capping of rates. In other areas, there's more a regulatory approach with guidance and the ability for ministers to step in if things look out of line, which is actually the other approaches that were proposed to ministers and not accepted. Is that in New South Wales, a third of their revenue comes from capital grants from central government, which they can use unconditionally on what their communities want them to spend it on. It doesn't come with strings from central government, whereas here, in New Zealand, that's not the case. I think on New Zealand average, I think the paper said 1/6 came from central government grants, but I'd say ours is less than that.
So you could say you have a core budget that couldn't be touched, and then you have a discretionary budget, and people could vote on how much discretion they want to add to it. I mean, like, it's a different way of thinking of from a consumer point of view.
I suppose we have that to some degree already. You think about things like our roading, effectively because we only fund 49%, the rules at NZTA usually mean that councils do the right thing because they know that 51% of the cost of their investment is actually being subsidised. So the only thing that really that is fully discretionary is in those sort of community and other spaces. And then you go right back to the regulatory systems legislation and what's the purportedly changes there in terms of what councils should or shouldn't be doing in that space. So.
And I'm just going to raise this now, but I don't want to go down a rabbit hole on it, but I want to kind of put it in your mind before we get to the LTP discussions, is in these papers supporting this proposal, it talks about the core versus non-core services, or they call them core and nice to haves. The original proposal was around rates capping on the nice to haves, not on core services, which is also what they do in New South Wales. There are core services that the cap doesn't relate to, like waste collection, for example. The rates cap doesn't apply to that. And so not only did they not take that approach, that they actually had a list in one of these briefing papers of what was core and what was nice to have, and there's multiple references to nice to haves as examples, and they were things like playgrounds, community facilities, sports grounds, and so actually what you can see in the system improvements bill is everything except what they called culture that was on the nice to have list is now included in the definition of core services. So that's going to be interesting for us to try and navigate when we get to the LTP conversation, because this is actually the best information I've seen about what they thought core services actually were at a more granular detail than what ended up in the system improvements bill. So I just want to kind of plant that, but put a pin on it, because it's not as relevant to this proposal, because this applies to everything now. It doesn't just apply to non-core.
Well, it's a great context. And I mean, the hypocrisy, we got literally an email from Miles Anderson saying that Wanaka needs sports facilities and that we should be spending money on it, and showed a whole sort of lobbying group. And I was like, this is a bit too rich, but the hypocrisy that comes into it, I guess. I mean, I can now write a good letter back.
Yeah, can you CC us into it?
Yeah.
Right, so just moving through this proposal though,
Sorry to interrupt, just one thing before we move on, because it's in one of the slide decks, so I'm not sure it's relevant now. Talking about the calculations, and there was one suggestion that we include our visitor population.
Yes.
Into that. I'm not sure how, because at the end of the day, our rates are either on, we could either relate to our paying population. So I mean, to try and dilute an impact by spreading the rates across a larger population. I mean, there's maybe some danger to that, because part of that larger population aren't paying anything. So that's the only, I'm not sure where that was.
Some of them are paying, right, visitor accommodation, pays rates, pays DCs. I've always wondered why we sort of argue they don't pay nothing. I mean, if we get our models right for our
But they could pay more.
But the problem...
Yeah, through the DC, presumably.
So,
Rating.
and that's a valid point, that our, there's been a bit of talk the last week or so about resident population, is low, and that 28% or whatever of homes are empty at census night. But whereas visitor numbers are high, much higher, and in fact, according to the latest statistics, have increased 14% annually the last few years, but the spend has decreased. So overall spend, so there's other factors. This is much more complex. What is available? How do we get the value to be able to fund the infrastructure we need? And it gets back to the economic argument that if we're constrained in the quality of services that we're able to provide to our community and the local economy, the national economy suffers, revenue to the government suffers. So there's a strong argument here for us to say, look, this is different. There's aspects of it that aren't actually workable. We need to be able to take a more constructive approach.
So when we start talking about the LTP, that'll be one of the early discussions we have about all of the different things we have to consider in terms of what we have to include and then how we would fund it. And this does have so visitors and growth both have an implication on rates capping, because the reason our whole business case for the visitor levy is that on peak days, we've always said our population doubles, in fact, it more than doubles now, and our ratepayers pay for that. There are some differentiated rates for commercial accommodation, but that doesn't make up the difference, which was our whole business case for the visitor levy. So the consideration of visitors in this calculation is where if we were constrained to only delivering infrastructure across our population, if we divide it by our population, then essentially it would restrict us to only investing in infrastructure that can service our population.
Which means yes.
And we don't. We deliver infrastructure and services that service both our resident population and a visitor population that is the same size on peak days as our resident population. So for us, if this calculation was done spreading across your resident population, it would result in a lower, essentially a cap than if you were thinking about the whole population.
But do we not need to make those differences for saying one and the other? Because if we're looking at our population, this is all we can spend. This is what we actually need to spend. And that difference should be the gap that we need to get from government.
Well, that gap theoretically is the gap that we're asking for to be covered by the visitor levy.
And I think the key thing for us is that, again, it's the outlier, right? Because every community has a degree to which there are visitors or people who don't effectively pay or contribute. The problem or the challenge that we have is most communities that might be perhaps 3 to 5% of their total spend of their total investment. We're at a point where it's more, in some instances on average 30% more. So it's just a matter of degree that we, and argue a couple of other little communities such as Mackenzie, and for a bit different reason have. The other one is, of course, that the rate of, and I think when I walked in the room, Penny, you were talking about the fact that the system works okay in a steady state environment, or it works okay where you've got a lot of a history of large infrastructure that has capacity that is not being consumed rapidly. So we've got no historic infrastructure because we've come from nowhere, and we're consuming our capacity faster than even our most ambitious expectations. And so that's the double challenge. We're never in a steady state. We're always effectively chasing our tail. And you two are now confusing me by sitting there. So
and together with that is the historic ineffectiveness, marginal effectiveness of development contributions to fully fund the speed at which that is happening at the time it's happening. And so that's the other element, is the growth, the speed at which our growth occurs also has an impact on this.
But also, DCs are also impacted by the borrowing cap you're working with. Right? So DCs are fine if you're well inside your borrowing cap. The high growth councils are always bumping up against the tops of their borrowing cap, which means that suddenly you're starting to constrain the investments you can make. that you then need to recover.
Or having to increase rates.
Or you'll then have to
borrow more.
increase rates to then pay for the interest to have even higher levels of borrowing. So you get into that sort of triangle between your ability to borrow, the cost of interest to be the speed at which you can recover it, and the rates you're having to charge to service the debt.
And not being legislated to stop a development based on infrastructure deficit. Because that's the other thing, you can't choose not to invest in the infrastructure in the same vein. I guess like this is a perpetual cycle that we're going through, most Western countries are, because then they just keep
But
doing
that
it.
logically, it's not enforceable. They cannot require a local authority to spend money it A, cannot rate for, and B, cannot borrow for. There's no way that the two can, it simply can't work.
So that's the idiosyncrasy that I was referring to earlier.
No, they said no now, in the future, yeah.
In terms of the system not being looked at as a system, because on one hand, they're saying you have to cap your rates. On the other hand, they're saying you must plan for the infrastructure to deliver the anticipated growth, the growth that is projected.
And growth must pay for growth. So
And growth must pay for growth, except for where it can't pay for growth, you have to pay for it from rates. And so, but those things don't necessarily work together, because if you can't increase rates beyond a certain amount, development levies, if development levies don't fully cover it at the time you need it, but you have a planning bill that says you must provide infrastructure that meets that, then I guess then you're in a variance situation on the rates capping, but they're not looking at those as a system. And perhaps those aren't as big those are not as big a concerns for other districts, but because we have high visitors, high growth, constrained infrastructure, then, you know, they're all coming to a pretty pointy decisions for us in that next phase.
We'll be able to say, you know, we have to potentially go beyond the 4% because we're going to need to put these projects on our LTP in order to collect the DCs. So we have to increase our rates revenue. Is that going to be an argument we can?
Well, if they're in there because you're collecting DCs, that doesn't necessarily mean your rates increases. The rates increase will it would only drive an increase in rates if there's a timing gap. But what you would be able to do is to go through a variance process, or as we'll get to in our last item today, what they want us to do is they want us to say, we're going to find alternative funding and financing for this. We're going to find a private developer who's going to provide this whole tranche of infrastructure, or we're going to set up an IFFA and fund it through that.
Yeah.
So that's what they're driving us to use. They want us to get other people to deliver it and to find other ways to fund it that are not rates, and frankly, there probably aren't DLs either. So this is driving it, and this is what when we get to the LTP discussion, the first discussion is what is the infrastructure that is needed? Then what is the rates implication if we were to deliver all of that? How would that flow through into rates capping? What are the DL and DC implications? Because our LTP will have to have both of those because the policy only changes partway through. And then, okay, well, what part of this should we, or are we already investigating alternative delivery and funding mechanisms for to take them off our books so that we fall within all of these constraints we've been given?
So they can say, we made them reduce their rates, but at the end of the day, people are still paying.
Or
Because
paying
nothing's free.
substantially more.
Yeah, or paying
That's just not
substantially
through
more.
rates.
Yeah. Or we can go through a variation process.
Yeah.
Or variation.
Yeah.
Surely our best option is still the visitor levy because it gives us the control and there's no cap on how much we can make off it.
So,
Well, visitor levy is one of the opportunities, but we aren't in control of that. With an IFFA, we could do it. Whereas for visitor levy, we need government to legislate to enable us to do it.
but that is one of the key issues, right? That they keep saying, look for these alternative systems.
Yeah.
We have, you know, for all the cost side of being this high growth tourist destination district, we have one tool that actually could create a new funding stream that is not impactful on existing parties, and that is accommodation levies.
Yep.
And so that's why they're used around the world in communities just like ours.
And it doesn't take money from the government.
Doesn't take money.
It's
Creates
fairer
a new
on
revenue
visitor
stream.
accommodation because you're not charging them higher rates based on assuming they're full. You're just charging based on when people turn up.
Yeah.
Mm.
I mean, and obviously then you wouldn't be having the sort of the differentials on those. So it is a very clean outlet, and I think, you know, we've heard from countless ministers and countless officials that everyone accepts it's a great tool, except that no one's prepared to actually sign on the dotted line.
Although Labor was close.
Oh, we were more than close. We were drafting the legislation with their agreement.
So a change of government potentially.
Could do, but even in parts of this government, we've heard good support for it. We just haven't seen that in the way that the three-headed three-headed government works. There's been no political will to make that happen.
What's the hesitation? Why?
Well, one is no new taxes.
Yeah.
And it's equated as a tax by some parts of government.
Well, it would also help if they hadn't diverted the international visitor levy at the moment away from funding us as well. So,
But that's a drop in the hat compared to
True.
accommodation levy.
But
Well, I mean, my back of the envelope calculation for visitor levies, our share would be about 35 million, which is not to be sniffed at. You know, they're reckoning 350 million collected at the border this year. So.
Oh yeah, it'd be nice.
And if you look, we've got 20% of all international guest nights here. You can do the maths.
So I think
we'll never get it, but
one of the big differences is again that remains government money to hand out.
Yeah.
And you know they've said is it 60% of that IVL is for tourism promotion, not for supply side management.
That was their interpretation.
at the moment,
And at the moment, but probably unlikely to change short term.
Well, we've actually just been through, I think, the government agency that administers that, the MB, just came to us recently and said, you know, have you got any calls on the IVL? And we went through all of the things we've been talking about through the regional deal. Doesn't meet the criteria, doesn't meet the criteria, doesn't meet the criteria. So their criteria is, I mean, is not aligned with what you would think that should be spent on, from our perspective.
But the IVL's got too many fingers in the pot. Whereas a visitor levy specifically for our district, no one else touches.
And I mean, we went right through that process of, you know, with Treasury of identifying, you know, where the cost imposts were, where the costs lay. We went through the process of acknowledging that we would be audited, that our spend could only be used on those things, so it wasn't a runaway train to just earn money. Look, I mean, we've been down that, and the regional deal pictures the same thing. So.
We are getting positive indications through the regional deal that it's not totally off the table, but, you know, we're not getting, yes, you're in.
So the other, just segueing slightly, the other thing that the whole rates capping and this discussion we've been having around infrastructure, you know, I suppose one of the things that we need to also think about is we're trying to build communities. We're not simply building modern sort of, we're not simply building roads and putting pipes in and getting people houses up. I mean, I think this community and most communities have wanted to put in that social infrastructure, and we know that that's already lagged and consistently lags in most councils because it's the hardest to justify. It's not the most expensive, but it's a key part, particularly if you look at the speed at which we're growing, to what's happening in the Upper Clutha, but here also we're running up against all those indices about levels of sporting facilities, cultural facilities, arts facilities that we're simply not. Our communities are crying out for, our population is demanding, but our ability to then fund those in amongst those higher order competing core infrastructures such as water and wastewater and roading and such is really proving to be very difficult.
Actually, that's a good segue to this slide. So this slide is finances rough, very rough, recalculation of the remaining years of the current LTP with water taken out to look at what the rates increases look like. So what you'll see is that spike in the early years is finance are looking a bit more into what that is, but my interpretation of that would be that when we did the LTP, for those of you who are returning councillors and were part of that process, we had the first 2 years was absolutely full on must-dos, and they were basically all water. There was some things that were already underway. Year 3, we were able to bring in a little bit of community stuff as well as the water stuff. And then it wasn't until outside of that first 3 years that we then were able to bring in some more big community projects. So the QEC Courts expansion, Valentine Road, some of those, so those big projects were then in those years 5, 6, 7 of the LTP, which is, I suspect, what that spike at the beginning is. And then the rest of the LGP got filled up with the water projects again, so the growth areas. But what you'll see there is that we've got that spike, but then we've got decreasing and below the 2% increases. So again, this is something I wanted to plant for you to think about before we go into the LGP discussions, because as we've been talking about the establishment of the water CCO, we had quite a lot of discussions through that process around when you take out water, we have enormous headroom left in terms of the available debt for council to borrow, and originally that was identified as an advantage of setting up a CCO. We had a lot of conversations about the fact, is that an advantage? Because we wouldn't call on that debt because that would involve increasing rates, and we still want to look at the water charges and rates together. What this is indicating, now this is just looking at the way we calculate rates now and the way that we measure it. So based on what I said before, we don't know exactly how the government is going to ask us to measure it, but this would indicate that actually this tells a story that we're not investing enough in those non-water services and assets, and that under this model we might need to increase rates to invest more in those areas. And I'm saying that very cautiously though, on the basis that their formula is a formula of principles, and so it's difficult to know whether how this actually applies. But what this shows is that we wouldn't be meeting that 2%.
Just thinking, what the graph also says to me, I could be wrong, because I don't know how many projects we're doing in those years, but if you want to do a significant project, how do you the spike? Do you know what I mean? Like, yes, we're not doing anything in those later years, but the minute you have a project, given that we're doing so little, it becomes a significant part of our program. If you want to build a sports centre, it's going to cost 150 million or something. Does that naturally spike you if you're not smoothing the delivery of it? Like, how long? Well, that's something that we'll talk about when we do the LTP, and that is something that we always look at with LTPs, is to try, because this was a combined program with water in it, and so we those spikes were looked at a combined level. Well, so not spikes. How you spread that investment was looked at in a different way because we're balancing with water. This might not be the answer here, but for example, Valentine Road's first phase of that, that might only be a project that's going to take a year. And so we put it all in 1 year because we could, because actually the sooner that we got that out of the way before we started on the Eastern Corridor water infrastructure, the better. But we could have spread it over 2 years if we needed to spread that investment from a rates capping perspective or from a delivery perspective. So there's ways you can structure delivery of projects to fit into the overall pattern. If you spread the spike, we're in the right gaps. So we're not spending not enough. If you spread that spike evenly across those gaps, we're in the red band.
So when you're looking at those annual increase, that's 10. It's not a reduction of 8. It's only a 2 and then a 2 and a 2. So there's a spike that's in the year of when the debt goes up or whatever. And then your rates are still increasing.
Yeah, those are a percentage, I guess, absolutely.
And it's also the debt structuring, it's also we might have decided, so one of the things that we're still looking at is that might have been a year that we decided we were going to make a big repayment on the leaky building debt. It might not actually be about a project. Okay. So we're looking into that. Okay. And when we start talking about the LTP, we'll talk about that more in terms of what's like.
We also know that that was reflective of the reality we had at the time, which was very water and infrastructure heavy. If that does come out, and bearing in mind, as Councillor Cox used to remind us, people are still paying that cost for water, they're just paying it differently. So we've got to be mindful about the risk of just rushing to more debt to do more projects. But what this does do, it enables us to rethink projects that either have been on the books or are on the books for years out beyond the 10-year horizon, or projects that actually do then start to be able to be brought forward and to be realised in a much more efficient way as the district continues to grow.
So on that, I think I asked this last time we discussed this, but provision for, if growth is intended to pay for growth, then differential rates for new developments. So it doesn't affect the rates currently charged for current properties But for those areas that are new, that are putting substantial demand on our needing new roading network and controls investment, and on the other hand, into the water infrastructure funded differently, but rating them at a higher rate to pay for that additional cost and then not affecting the rest. Are we doing that at all at present? Oh, that's right. I asked the local government New Zealand guy, and he said, yes, it's feasible. It's not done much, but is it done here at all?
I don't think it's that simple, because every time you put in a new piece of infrastructure, there's very little infrastructure which is purely growth related, and the aspects that should be wholly growth related and can be ring fenced to a certain community should be recovered through your DCs. But you've always got renewals and you've got the changes in level of service, and they do tend to be spread across the whole of the benefiting community. And and to the extent that we already largely fund most of our infrastructure by projects as opposed to scheme-based rather than across the district, our rates are quite differentiated, because you're only basically, you've got the Cadrona scheme, you'll have the Kingston scheme. And the other model that's coming in, of course, is to split. So you end up with people paying potentially DCs, but you also have people paying fixed uniform annual general charges to recover parts of debt going forward. And that's the whole IFFA model. Fundamentally, you would recover part through one mechanism, part through another mechanism. And so, and I mean, as long as you're continuing to do it on a scheme-based system, and that has its challenges, and council's discussed already whether it should smooth some of that, because some of the little communities are going to find the cost of actually converting their schemes to be
Central Otago.
Hugely challenging. So at what point does the community at large say actually spreading that cost across the whole community is actually fairer for everybody? It's a small charge on everybody rather than a humongous charge on a small community.
Right, that's the sort of conversation I'd like to have through the LTP, so that we're looking, so we have a policy that tries to at least mitigate all of those issues, and there won't be one solution to fix everything, but I think we could, because otherwise we would get, and we're getting it already now, developers providing significant pushback to any change to development contributions, because it gets in the way of them doing and gets in the way of the government's objectives. But there are other ways of doing it, which means that those who then benefit from those properties in the future actually pay more, and it might help mitigate the broken market.
Yeah, so I think one of the things we'll need to keep in consideration, though, is a lot of the costs and the infrastructure you're talking about that are mostly relevant there are water,
sure,
which is not part of our LTP, and so a lot of the conversations we'll be having with the LTP relate to transport infrastructure that is not within a new development.
Or
it's about network infrastructure, or it's social infrastructure, some of which is in new, growth areas and some of which is more network based.
Yep. Yeah, and some will be, so say for example, if we think about the Southern Corridor, you can imagine at some point, the work that the community services team around what is ultimately required there. Some of it will be very local, but actually some of it, but even by being local, it creates benefits elsewhere in the network. Yeah. So, you think about a new pool down there, not that I'm biased about pools, but you think about a new pool down there, it might relieve a lot of demand into Frankton for me. I mean, for people.
Well, in fact, that's a really good example, because all of the community facilities that would be put in the Southern Corridor will relieve current pressure on QEC in particular, and enable capacity to be filled from other areas, because any future growth there will be absorbed by the community facilities that were built there. So I guess that does, that will...
There are always flows.
Yeah.
Yeah, quick question. In terms of a rate cap, is it strictly year by year, or is it over the life of the plan? So, because otherwise we end up with unintended consequences. We maybe spread things out. We don't build them at the most appropriate time. We'll have to split them over 2 financial years to meet the rate cap. So we may not make the best spending decisions because we have to meet the cap, where if it was averaged over 3 or 4 years.
Unclear.
It would have to be your first three though, because everything beyond that just gets messy, right? So it would have to be.
It's a good question, actually.
Yeah, that's something we.
It's the same issue with the point that John made before, but government's excessive rushes and things like the COVID shovel ready, and equally some of the stuff around water upgrades of wastewater treatment plants. If government sets these artificial timeframes and says everyone's got to do this within 5 years, guess what? The price just goes up through the roof because the market knows that that's what has
everyone's competing for the same resources.
Yeah, I mean the other thing, if you're talking about maybe roading networks, not necessarily water, probably say apply. You can get a fast track come through for its, whatever. Well, it's great, but we're maxed out for the next 3 years. Sorry, because my understanding is we need a 30-year housing capacity, which we've got. We need an infrastructure plan to service that, which we've got. So anything new, why would we have to if we've already met those basics?
Yeah. The spatial plan backs it up.
So the spatial plan requirements in the future will require us to have probably more a tighter link with the infrastructure plan for 30 years. But the legislation that's in here, the legislation requires us to be able to be flexible to changes, including fast track. So that's right, isn't it, Anita? Yeah. So we can set out what we want. The problem, as Mike said before, is what happens in this district is the time frame over which it actually happens is always faster than what we thought it was going to be.
So that big Frankton main upgrade might just turn right and head towards Arrowtown somewhere, because it's the fast track's coming in. Yeah, it's. I mean, but those are the real world challenges of having that fix and linking our ability to pay for some of that infrastructure to our debt at our rates cap.
Yeah, and that is one of the...
Can't do it all.
No, and that's the challenge with the rates cap, is you have fast tracks that are approved after you've set your rates and you set your program, but also, and maybe Liz can talk to this a bit more when she talks about development levies, because I might have this wrong, but things like the BP roundabout, that's not even us, and it's certainly not covered by development levies. So you might have fast tracks, we've got a whole lot of fast tracks out in the Wakatipu Basin, that might get approved in terms of housing, but they're not, at the moment, the way that development levies are structured, they wouldn't contribute to upgrading network infrastructure. Yeah, so the pressure that those developments put on our transport network is not at the site of those developments, it's in other places in the network. And sometimes those aren't even always visible until after the fact, although the transport model is doing a lot of modelling. So that is where it gets really tricky, because the fast tracks get approved, then you go, oh, now we need to do these network upgrades that they are not paying for. So growth is not paying for growth because we're looking at a network level, but we're capped in our rates.
I'm just mindful, John, that we've had a great discussion.
Yeah.
But you've got a big program to continue to get through the rest of the day. In terms of what you are looking for from councillors to help Campbell with finessing his draft submission, which he's done a lot of work on already.
Yeah.
Like have you got enough councillors believe we've canvassed enough stuff for us to have captured the flavour of where you want to be?
Yeah, I mean,
no. I'd like to see a discussion of long-term debt. I don't want to steal your audit finance, but in here I don't see the fact that we have major infrastructure projects and that those need to be funded, and that maybe the IF, that the infrastructure entity may not be sufficient for that. I think that we can raise offshore debt, and we can raise it cheaply, and it actually won't have that much of a rates impact. I just did a quick calculation on a 6% notional bond divided by population, and actually wouldn't be that much. But we have other revenue sources, and one of those is long-term debt. And we are not at our ceiling of 270% anymore now that we've got the CCO. But even if we were, we would still have more room to go up to 330% as a high growth council.
Yeah, so in terms of the rates cap, I think what you're saying is a conversation for the LTP and how we fund our proposed program. But in terms of the cap, what this is essentially talking about is whether you are rates funding or, in fact, this is pushing you towards more debt funding than rates funding because there's a lower rates implication for debt funding. So that's another driver behind the government doing this. So the government has this view that councils 100% rate fund infrastructure projects that should be debt funded. And in some councils, some councils it is, not for us. So one of their other drivers behind this is likely trying to push councils into debt funding rather than rates funding. But for the purposes of this conversation, it's about, well, I guess.
But wait a second, if we have debt, we have an interest rate, and that interest rate feeds back into rates.
Yes.
And so at some level, that's going to feed back in that 2 to 4% notional.
Yes, but it has a smaller impact, as you pointed out, than if you pay for a project 100% funded through rates, which is what, for example, Wellington was doing with their water projects.
Right. Okay, all right, so we're on the same page.
Yeah.
The tone that I keep getting is that it's like we're the consequence of confidence, where you're like an employee of a boss who's not listening to you and they just keep throwing more work and no pay to it. That's the dynamic that I'm getting between local and central. I guess the point being is that in order for that person to feel heard, at some point it either needs to stop doing work or do something bold enough or dramatic enough to be heard. And that's why I guess I'm saying, like, giving you the license to be more bold, to be more obvious, to be more sort of strong, and this specifically, to have a very clear narrative rather than go down a lot of technical things. I just think at this point, need to push back a little bit harder. And I don't see any consequence of doing that on this one.
So pushback, I guess the key thing for us to understand is what you want us to push back on. My personal perspective on this is because their formula is so principles based, I can't tell you whether this is going to have a negative impact on our ability to invest in infrastructure projects or not. All I've got is this. And I don't know if this actually reflects what they are wanting to calculate. So from my perspective, I want them to get really clear on how you would actually apply this so that we can tell you what the implications are. Because it could result in us not able to invest in infrastructure to cover the infrastructure deficit to support our community, but it might not. It depends how they calculate it.
I guess the point is that when we did that systems thinking of, this creates that, creates this, creates that, and it comes back at the start, making the submission more around that of going, you need to see the whole system and how it's presented because you're, hypocritical around a lot of things. There's a lot of contradictions here and there, and it can focus on that because I think in the same way, they're not able to see their own irony. And in order for them to see it, it needs to be just plain and obvious and loud. In the same way that that employee, like if you can't explain it complicated, explain it simply. But,
and their turn. So it gets back to, again, so if they've got a program which is pro-growth, which is what is very clear. There's no, the lack of clarity is around the lack of connection between the various agendas they've got running, so all reforms. So therefore, again, putting the argument that they're not well connected, we need to have, if the rates caps applies as it vaguely is articulated at present to Queensland Lakes District Council, it will mean that the other imperatives that the government has will not be able to be delivered to.
So, or will have to be paid for in other ways.
Yeah, that's right. And we can put that argument again, and more often we put that argument, eventually something will give, but because otherwise it's not going to be achieved. It's
well, again, it's not going to be listened to if it's not loud enough.
That's right.
So if we go into trying to make it amenable and figure out a way that we can accommodate it, I think it's more important to the big, fat, obvious sort of solution right in front of you, whether it's visitor levy or GST or other mechanisms that really empower us to do the job that they want us to do. But I guess keeping it simple and high level and bold.
And or have a clear model of a formula that really takes into account high growth, that high growth that we're experiencing, and the fact that we have a very low population. So I'm sure you make them anyway. For those arguments, I think Cody's right. Make sure that it is clearly articulated that otherwise it's simply not deliverable.
But at a very high level, this is here because politicians just want to say we're spending too much money, we're wasteful, we're spending it on rubbish things, right? That's their starting point, okay? So I don't think there's a single council around the country that wants to jack another couple of % on its rates just because it can. So we have to be, what falls off the table, and we know at the end of the day what will end up falling off the table will be all the community facilities and all the community services and all our community grants, because we can't stop. We have to have all the other stuff, but that's what will fall off the table.
And I agree stating that. Stating it very clearly, having, leaders from MPs saying you need to spend money on sports facilities and getting direction saying that you shouldn't spend money on sports facilities. Yeah. I think just being like blatantly obvious to pull out, I've made the point 30 times, sorry. Moving on.
I think this is an important point to pick up in your session on Thursday about advocacy generally, in terms of if you want to make that point clearly and loudly, is a letter that's going to some low-level officials in MB to be analysed by AI and put into a report for a minister or a select committee, which is what they've stated they're going to do with it. Yeah. Is that loud and clear, and is it getting the attention? Or are there other mechanisms? I'm not saying we don't do one here. I'm just saying that's a really good thing to take into your advocacy discussion on Thursday. Cool. Because what are ways that we could more loudly advocate for the position?
You've touched on something here, because I think a lot of these submissions we make, I almost feel like we're a broken record. Mm-hmm. We talk about we're a high growth, highly desirable, low population. We need unique tools for a unique situation, but we say that in every submission, regional deals, the works. So maybe we need to think about a change of tact here.
Well, so I think what is probably in the past, I think that we've assumed that a person with some skin in the game to make decisions on the future reads every submission. And in the past, perhaps they did, the select committee did, but what they now tell you when you're doing a submission on this will be analysed by AI. And so what the decision makers will see is a summary and analysis of what everybody said. And because we're an outlier,
we don't get it.
And it might get picked up. It might. I'm not saying.
Send the right cues to AI.
But so in terms of and whether when you're reading one that's an outlier, when you read 500, sticks in your mind anyway. So as I say, let's not. But I think for Thursday, that's a really good thing for you guys to pick up. What is the valuable way for us to provide that?
When I was reading through that this morning, that how do we effectively advocate? What is the most effective way of advocating and trying to influence that change?
Yes.
That's a really good discussion.
I think one of the things that I think we'll reflect on is that systems of government never deal well and don't like outliers. They aim for the broad middle. Yeah. And unfortunately, this district is an outlier on virtually everything we do. And which is why we promoted the idea of special economic zones. We've promoted the idea of regulatory sandboxes to say, actually, because we don't fit anybody's mould, there is an opportunity to do things differently here. And to be fair, the last Labor government did show some interest in that, but generally governments don't, and governments do not like writing legislation for specifics. They like writing legislations for the slip being in the middle.
Unless it's Auckland.
Yeah, this is Auckland.
And then Auckland is such a behemoth in terms of the well-being of our economy. But arguably, so are we. Yeah. But I've certainly had it many times. Stop telling us how special you are.
Fisheries and mining aside.
Could you remind us of the
special economics on one show?
If we've got a 2 to 4% increase, where does our starting point?
That's part of what hasn't been made clear and was really important in the New South Wales case is how do you measure the baseline that you're taking
where's your baseline that you're taking your 2 to 4 from? The other thing, so I'm interested in that, if we could get some clarity around that.
There's no ability to get clarity, but that is one of the things that we should comment on.
Right. And the other thing I like John's point about, because 2 to 4 is a really narrow band, and we may be forced to increase rates in some years where we don't need to, up to 2, because we have taken water out, let's not forget. So we are looking at a whole different bunch of activities. So, to artificially force us to squish between that narrow band, I think the averaging concept is interesting, like over any 3 years or over...
rolling average.
Yeah, how can it
So
Yeah.
the New South Wales model, I'm pretty sure, is year on year, because they recalculate it each year. So I don't know how that works for their long-term planning process, actually. That wasn't covered in
It's
the
very
briefings.
squishy for the limited number of services we're now providing. I mean, I know they're still significant, but massive chunk gone. So it just feels like if you have to do something quickly to get it done more cheaply, you know, it doesn't lend itself. Or you might have to do one project and then another and not be able to do things concurrently. That, you know, it just feels
Because
like...
if you think about why it came in though, it was popular politics to get rates down.
Yeah.
But it's
And
not,
so it's
though.
impacted every
But
year.
it might not be, you know, I mean, ultimately, depending on where the baseline is and whether we're forced to go up to 2 in some years, you know, for the others, their natural inflation increase is significant, and our water CCO we know is going to be more. So, I mean, you know, ultimately, the cost to households is probably going to be more under this model than we were before, it feels like to me. I don't know why they're putting a minimum in there, but with the...
Part of the reason for the minimum is to ensure that the popular politics of 0% rates increases doesn't result in a future deficit.
That clearly hasn't been an issue, or they wouldn't be doing what they're doing, you know.
But it has been an issue.
Way back.
I mean, for example, for us, we had
Not
how
recently.
many years when we had,
That's right.
yeah, but
6, 1.5.
yeah, recently enough.
Compounding cost
Yeah.
of not keeping the rates moving is huge.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is, you know, for a year or, you know, depending on how we can't do a lumpy.
No, and that's right, we do want to smooth, because people do also like consistency in their rating.
But sometimes the projects might require
It might,
lumpy
yeah.
because of the
You have
limited
debt headroom, you
services.
could manage that better than we can at the moment.
Yes.
Just,
Yeah, in fact, that is how you.
You could try and take GST up rates to help us all that.
That would be nice.
AI, treasuries, but the AI would just...
Yeah.
Yeah, it would. Any reference to that?
Treasury's advice through all of these briefing papers is that they don't think it's a good idea.
Let's agree with you on that.
Well, capping rates.
Okay, we were sort of
Okay, right.
2 o'clock.
Yes.
So,
Are we having a break at 2 o'clock?
Yes. Are we doing?
Yes, a break in 15 minutes.
Yeah.
And then into development levies and IFFA.
5
Can't
minutes, 5 minutes and then, yep.
A big one.
Okay, we're going to reconvene and keep moving. So we're on to the enthralling subject of development levies, which I'm really looking forward to hearing about. I'm so excited. And, you know, development contributions are one of those sort of, you know, black magic art sort of things that I think most of us don't really know enough about. So I think as we start thinking about new regimes, thinking about what we don't know about the current one to take forward into the new one, it's really key. So, yeah, look forward to the presentation.
I'll just set a quick context, 2 things. One is this is set out as 2 different items, development levies and then IFFA, but I suspect they're just going to flow in and out of each other. So if you have IFFA thoughts as they're talking about development levies, feel free to raise them. The other thing is that in terms of the detailed understanding of the development contribution system and the development levy system, I think Catherine has organised a session with, or is in the process of organising a kind of education session with Meredith Connell to go into more of the detail with you on development contributions. So this session isn't going to go into all that detail. It's going to focus on the key things that are changing and how they impact our ability to fund growth. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'll hand over to these guys.
Yep. So me, Anita, Liz Simpson, Jessie Taylor, and we also have Dominic Munden, who he is in charge of the DC team. So we're all here to discuss this today. So this is just a really good introduction slide, just showing where it fits in, and it's the development levies in relation to Pillar 2, and that's really about enabling growth paying for growth, just freeing up and making it easier. So the key changes that are happening is we're going from a development contribution to a development levy system. There's improvements to the IFFA, and as what Penny just talked about, the changes to targeted rates. So it's really important when we're looking at all these reforms, we're thinking them as a system, although as Mike pointed out, they may have not really taken place, but they actually all really do impact on each other. So it's it's really important that we maintain that sort of overall arching approach. I won't dwell too much on this slide. I think I might just move to this side. So essentially development contributions served a purpose for a while, and it was essentially they were made when we couldn't predict where growth was happening. So we've entered into a period where growth is happening a lot faster, a lot quicker, and what we actually need is a more flexible approach to funding and financing our infrastructure. So the key challenges we have, development contribution currently are charged in relation to a project basis. So there's that casual nexus approach, which creates inflexibility in terms of if we want to bring other projects forward or other things become a priority. The LGA requires a policy to be in effect at the time of the application, and essentially you're charged at a particular time when you get your consent approved. So that means the cost of that enabling infrastructure is not necessarily always recovered in time, and council must fund infrastructure up front. So we have got situations whereby we have developer agreements, and if we can think of like the likes of Padrona, and we're also using targeted rates, but there's also less certainty for us as a council when we are going to fully recover those costs. So what the levy is proposing is a better system for funding growth, and I think at a high level, I think if we looked at it at the high level, I think these changes are really positive, and Liz and Jessie jump in at any point. And essentially they're trying to create a system that's more flexible and a better system to capture growth, which is nationally consistent. So the key shift is moving away from that project focus and looking at more of a levy area focus. Another key thing is with the existing policy that was over a 10-year period, this is moving more to a 30-year period in line with spatial plans, LTPs and water strategies. It also introduces some oversight from the Commerce Commission and mandates reviews and stakeholder consultation. So the levy zones, these are essentially looking at areas, bigger areas. So you could, for instance, look at the Whakatapa as a whole and the Upper Kluka as a whole. And essentially that's where I think the biggest benefits of this policy come when you're looking at it at those those larger areas. It also gives you the ability to do some high cost levy zones. And if you take the example for us, maybe it's really hard to make any sort of assumptions on what they're saying because they haven't actually released the method of how we actually do this. And so the devil is actually going to be in the detail common. Common thing. So what is a high levy zone? So for example, if we looked at how we are right now, that may be a high levy zone in terms of wastewater because what we know is in general wastewater over there is a lot higher. So that could be an example of an area that might be a high levy zone, or it may not. It just depends on the methodology of how that comes about. Though also levies are no longer linked to the life of the consent and they can be reassessed on a 3-year cycle. So timing of payments can now be charged when consent is granted. So I think that's quite beneficial to us. Providers, we're required to use a nationally prescribed methodology, which is consistent, and that government oversight. And also a process will be established for proposed developments outside levy zones, and that's essentially to take into consideration things like fast track consents and those types of things. So if we look up here, so just sort of really summarising what we've had, so we're going from a project focused to more of a area, something that's more consistent with our spatial planning and the long-term planning focus. We are moving away from being tied to specific projects to being prescribed to different areas, although and having the ability to have some high cost overlays. We are moving away from cost recovery is based on actual costs of specific capital projects and for which it must be collected to the aggregate cost and having a bit more flexibility about reconsideration of the levies now at a more flexible time periods. Do you guys have anything else on that? No. Cool.
So Anita, can I just, in terms of a bit of a live example, so the Ladies Mile, for example, yes. So is the difference between what we're talking about contributions and levies is if you were developing a property on the Ladies Mile at the moment, you would just be paying DCs for the existing infrastructure, whereas the development levies could also include the future development of 516. Is that kind of what we're talking about here?
At the moment, we have mapped areas. So if you looked for Ladies Mile, you'll see that the catchment area is, I think, pretty much actually for that side of the road, so the three waters. But actually for roading and reserves, and the reserves and community facilities are part of a district-wide. So in effect, we're actually kind of doing what the levy system's already doing, because that's what we do for roading and all reserves and community facilities stuff. So they're split into a ward base rather than catchment. So technically, we can treat it like that.
To answer your question though, a DC is set down based on what you project to spend in the area over the 10 years, not just costs you've already incurred. Yes. So it looks both forward and back, but it's very isolated to that particular catchment. So it doesn't always recognise unintended or downstream effects of growth that kind of have a cumulative effect on the district as a whole. And it also doesn't provide us as infrastructure providers with much flexibility. If we've said, working within our debt ceiling and in line with the spatial plan, we'll prioritise this area first. Something happens with that developer, they're not primed, nothing's happening. Over here, we want to go, but we haven't provided for that in our LTP, so we have no mechanism of actually funding that and recovery.
Other than rates.
Or
if we want to get it started.
Or adjusting through our next LTP. Yeah, so it would enable us to be much more flexible with how and when we invest in growth infrastructure across the entire levy area.
Because the development levy picks up all projected projects in the whole area, not just Ladies Mile. I might look at all of Wakatipu. Still on the same basis of looking backwards and forwards.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, but it picks up a bigger area.
The other thing we find is if we might be engaging with a developer on their internal reticulation, and we identify an opportunity to upsize, a bit of betterment in some of their trunk infrastructure. If we hadn't anticipated that in our LTP, we aren't then fully recovering that as growth because it's not featuring in the TC for that area. Does that make sense?
But we would be able to in future because we don't need.
Under levy, we would. Yeah.
Thanks. And obviously, quite a bit of the levies is going to be related to three waters. I'm assuming the CCO will not be able to charge levies, so
they'll have their own
they
policy.
can do their own, so we don't have to collect them on their behalf. And
we could.
We could.
I think the legislation allows for us to do it on their behalf, but that'll be a decision for their board as to whether they want to have their own DL policy or do it through us.
And we charge
right, yeah, Jesse?
Yes. We charge them for the service.
Oh, yeah.
And then obviously a lot of the existing DCs are based on a standard dwelling unit, have 3 people living in it. I'm not sure when we last built a standard dwelling for 3 people down at Hanley. So how do we recognise that the houses we're building often have 5 or 6 bedrooms, have 10 or so people living when it comes to impact on things like community services or roading or all of that? So is that, where's there opportunity to talk about, is that in the long-term plan and the review of these policies?
In the review of the DC and DL policy, but that was actually looked at last year, I understand.
We do have
specifically the impact of residential flats.
But the methodology will be set by national government now, so we may or may not have much input into how that looks, and we don't really know what that's. They've given us a little bit of information on charging by bedrooms, but we don't know anything about volumetric charging or anything like that.
This is part of the growth, paying for growth, and it's not at the moment. And part of the reason is we're building much bigger properties than the standard assumptions that we're allowed to collect towards our water and wastewater.
In the interest, for every house that has 10 people living in it, there's another 2 houses that have no one living in it. So,
well, so they're our ideal customer, aren't they? All those homes that are paying full rates and not using any services. You're right.
But we did go through that in the last term, so I know that through conference we'll have a better understanding of that process.
Cool.
So one of the other aspects to that is administrative efficiency. That was the big driver of the previous system. So that's why DEUs were used as the basis. Because in fact, the compliance cost, we do that for commercial buildings. We look at calculating their DCs once we know what the commercial building is, because it could be anything from a hotel to a warehouse. but it became administratively across the country completely inefficient to do that for houses. So in some respects, it is a bit of the current model is a slice, but we do allow for some discounting for small units. We already make some provision for that, and most councils do.
So, one, I support this, but two, who's going to be the calculation agent? Because if I'm the developer, I'm going to sit here and I'm going to want to argue with, the negative externalities that you say I'm creating. And then also, if I present this to government, they're going to want to know the same thing. So is it somebody downstairs with a calculator, or you're going to get, frankly, an army of economists to figure out what the externalities are that you're calculating for, and that you're basically present valuing back because they're going to be reaching way into the future? Who's going to do that? Or do you propose that you do that?
They'll give us a prescribed methodology, and Don's team, similar to what they do now with the development contributions, they will be, everything that comes through will be as per the development levy policy. They also, in terms of the actual legislation itself, they have, the regulator now is ComCom, which is quite interesting. So it's quite a different step away. So I think what they're trying to do is move away. I think other councils, and not necessarily us, have lots of issues with developers, debating it. I think, Don will probably be able to update more on that, but to try and limit appeals, I think, too. So that's why ComCom has been bought. But how that actually plays out in practice is going to be really interesting to see, because they're going to have to. That's going to be a massive area of growth for them too.
But then, Anita, what this points to, again, I think we're in a good position, because this points to actually having the sorts of things we have, say, with the Te Patahi and with Ladies Mile, that basically we have comprehensive views of what the future looks like.
Yes.
So this is pushing us more. This is actually quite neatly aligned with our whole long-term structure planning model that actually says we have a comprehensive view of what is needed, as opposed to only having a view to the next subdivision or to the next subdivision, because that's where you're coming from, Stephen, that actually if it's only measured on the next subdivision, you are invariably missing out some of the aggregated costs and impacts that only become suddenly become real after the fourth subdivision's hit you, and suddenly you realise that the roundabout down the road is completely stuffed.
And I think potentially, I think developer agreements will come a lot more. We'll see a lot more of them moving forward under this regime, and I think developers will potentially want to try and secure a lot more upfront, because it will be cheaper than if we renew them too. So I think there may be opportunities for council to potentially get some things, get some really positive things from this.
So the incentives for, sorry, hands going. I look at like development contributions and levies as like the ticketing and then rates as a subscription model once you're with it.
Yeah.
Is there a better ability, when you say it's more dynamic, is it always just going to be like a one-off fee, and if we get it wrong one year, we'll have to get it right the next year, or is there an element of staging it over multiple years?
You're supposed to update the policy every 3 years, and I think we have to be quite careful now with how it's done. There's a bit around the legislation setting when you're setting the policy that if you go out and you consult on it, and then for some reason something's wrong and you change the policy 3 months later to adjust it, and you've undercharged anyone that's come into that window of that 3 months, you can't suddenly charge them what the extra levy contributions are.
Right.
But equally, what this new regime does for us is previously, if someone got a subdivision consent, which could go for 8 years, they're charged at the beginning. So it doesn't matter if there's any change in those infrastructure costs between X and Y, they always pay what they always pay. Here, after 3 years, we can now redo the policy with additional costs. We can recharge that, although that holder of the consent will have something like, I think, maybe 12 months to pay the original, or they have to accept the new charges. So in that way, it's a much better for us, because we've never been able to do that before.
I suppose the other thing it does is, in an event where we have undershot and X cost a little bit more than we thought it was going to, typically that difference has been picked up by ratepayers. It would now be picked up by another growth somewhere else. So it does sort of support this notion of growth pays for growth. It might just be growth over here ends up topping up growth over here. That's potentially not the worst thing.
Right.
Well, it's not the worst thing for our existing ratepayers, for sure.
Yes.
It does mean we get more hooked on growth.
So what does that mean for future developers? Does that mean they potentially will be in the gun for high development costs and levies?
Possibly.
Which will put them off, possibly, or?
I think it depends. There's a lot of work to be done once we understand what the methodology is and the work we'll need to do to figure out how we want to create a levy area, whether it's Wakatipu wide or slightly smaller. And when we originally got some information last year, and this hasn't come through on any of this, they did some case study examples with us where you would include a levy area as long as it was in sort of 5%. So some people were paying a little bit more, so someone in Queenstown might be paying less, but and it would be a bit like that. And then anything that's set outside of that is where you'd create those sort of the higher levy area for those additional costs. So there are going to be kind of winners and losers within that framework, but equally, I think one of the big advantages is that if you have a really high growth area that's all going off in the eastern or the southern corridor, but you're still having to invest in Frankton and Queenstown, but it's a lot slower, you can recover that money and kind of move it around in that aggregated area, so that cross-subsidisation has some real benefits. But one of our concerns, and this is now moving over to the IFFF and the SPV, is that if suddenly you've designed this large area and it all sort of works out in terms of how you've done the math, and then you get a special purpose vehicle from a third party and they carve out the entirety of, say, the eastern corridor, all of a sudden you now have to review your levy area. And I mean, it could be a positive or negative, you've taken a chunk of costs out, but equally that may have been the fast growing area that was helping benefit that cross subsidisation and speed of getting Frankton paid down or Queenstown. I mean, it could do the other opposite way as well, but all of these things will interplay, and it's something we're going to be have to be mindful of when we're setting those levy areas around what happens if we know the eastern corridors suddenly pull out of the entire area. And
you're looking at 30 years forward too.
Yeah. Yes. You're talking about cross-subsidisation. I mean, how do you ring fence? How do you make sure that the money people pay in is developing their area? What's the...
So the whole model is based on not doing that.
Yeah, it's about the border. The whole point is to enable that to happen. So say if Eastern Corridor happened quicker, we could actually reprioritise our money and put it into Eastern Corridor to enable that to happen. So people in Southern
As
Corridor...
As long as someone somewhere else hadn't paid into it, expecting certain things to develop in their area, but you're not funding the infrastructure in that area because you're using it somewhere else.
They wouldn't be paying into it until they were developing.
But what I mean is a broader area that you're contributing to. So it might be better particular development. They've started, others haven't. They've contributed expecting this to happen. But if you're cross-subsidising, you're saying you can take and you can swap.
They don't contribute until they develop. All it means is that the amount they're contributing is based on the whole levy area's growth.
Yeah.
So they still don't pay it until they develop. So if they're slow, they haven't paid it.
No, I realise, but if they're fast, I guess what I'm saying is if they're fast, if they're the first movers in a particular area and they pay their levy, and then we delay because we're putting money elsewhere and our projects in that area slow down, other people pull it out. Are they, what is the recovery if we don't deliver the infrastructure that they're paying for? Is there a mechanism for that, or?
Not one that we've seen.
So they could end up paying for, a sports field and a this and a that, but it doesn't actually happen because the market sends growth in another direction, but we've already charged them for.
The levy still has requirements around how you set it, and so we can't be setting a levy and then just not delivering what we said we would. We might see a timing shift, or we might...
How long is relevant, isn't it? Is it time horizon? So I guess we're unique, and this is legislation that applies to everybody and probably works in different ways in different places depending on how fast growth is and how many different places are growing at any one time. It's just interesting how people might dip out via that mechanism because of the rate of scope of areas that are growing in this.
I think hopefully that's what the regulator will be looking at.
Yeah, I also think there's that risk that you're saying too, if you're the first mover. So if you're the first mover, you then go, okay, we're going to do all this work, we want compensation for council. The same thing could happen to them. They move first, so they can just, and then we have to prioritise the money to them, so you reimburse them too. So that the devil is really going to be in that detail of the methodology and how it all works and interplays together for us to be able to understand those risks.
It feels like it could be easier, but it also feels like it might be a little more unfair in some ways, or that there are risks for developers, and then maybe, as you say, that might be another, where the banks who are, investing, or whoever else is investing goes, actually, there's a bit of risk in this. I don't know.
Those risks do sit with us now, just because of the way the policy's currently set up. So, and I sort of went.
Well, the risks sit with
us
us
before. Transport and reserves, which are the two things that we already do and which will be retained, are already done on a ward basis. So we already have that situation where someone in Southern Corridor is paying a DC, but actually the reserve that went in was in Fernhill. The legislation at the moment does require for reserves, I think, that if the developer goes, I paid my DC 10 years ago and I want to see where that was paid and you can't demonstrate it, then technically you have to do a refund. And I think it's one of the reasons why we kept a ward base, because you've always got something going on somewhere. So I think we're still covered in that same kind of way. As long as you don't take Queenstown transport contributions and then put all your roading in Wanaka and do nothing, we should be okay. We're in the same kind of way.
I'm just interested in how we draw lines and.
I think the key is that this actually takes us back to where the very early DC policies were in the early 90s, which were based on broader catchments. And progressively over the years, changes to the legislation narrowed it down, so it became quite specific to individual projects, which became completely inefficient in terms of delivery. So in some respects, this is pushing it back to saying, actually, the costs aren't necessarily about the pipe outside your front door, they're about building the networks. Because remember, we're only talking about building the trunk systems here, because anything local is provided by the developers. So I don't think it's a case of, we're shutting up shop and suddenly taking money and delivering it somewhere else. But I think what it does is it does create additional flexibility about how you might take the flows of income coming in and apply them most efficiently to a development growth cell. And that would always require us to be mindful of where the development pressures were coming from by individuals inside, what might be quite a large growth cell area.
And so it's still based on the projects. It's just not attributed in the same way. So when the DL is set, it's set on the base, it will be in the future, it'll be set on the basis of our spatial plan says, this is how we're going to develop. This is the infrastructure we are planning on delivering to support that growth. And here's the development levies that reflect that. So whilst there might be things within a 3 years that slow down, we don't normally get a fundamental shift where within that period you've made a decision that we're building a community facility here, a road here and a blah here, that you totally change that and move to a different area.
But now we've got the water CCO, which is different again. So we may be depending on
no, the water CCO is the deal set the same way, and their economic regulation is actually much more stringent in terms of ensuring that 30-year view flowing from, well, it still has to flow from the same spatial plan that ours flows from into their water services strategy, and it still gets reviewed on a 3-yearly basis and all of that stuff. So the massive shifts from one area to another within a 3-year period are not as likely as they would be, because I think what you're indicating, because the DL is set on what we say we're going to do.
I think the current system that we have, it actually favours developers a lot more than it favours council, because we're committed through our LTPs to do things. The market is only committed as far as any developer chooses to put a section on the market, and that's often been the thing that catches councils out. Less so us because of the speed of the market here. But, you know, there's been many a case where councils have put in massive amounts of infrastructure only to see developers walk away for a decade, and councils and community are carrying the cost that has not been recovered at all.
Although there are others that are desperate to get moving and have invested lots in the whole planning process and stuff. I mean, just there is that counter view of developers.
Yes, except that until the day that they sign the consent and sell the section, they've committed nothing.
So now development levies charged for.
I mean, they've committed money, but in terms of where the real spend is.
There's a lot of money that's just sitting there and they're having to pay, depending on how much.
Not until they start developing sections. It's all a paper exercise. It's all lawyers until then, isn't it?
And that's a lot of money.
Do we have any idea on what sort of increase it's going to cause between DCs and DLs?
Not yet. We won't be able to do much before we get the methodologies to find.
Well, I think that's also a downside risk, in that we will now have a single stated methodology around the country.
Right.
So, you know, one of the things that we'll be looking at is how does that work where, you know, we're in an alpine environment, so potentially the cost of our roads are probably more expensive because they're more expensive to build and they're a lot more expensive to maintain. So the build standards will be higher.
Gisborne might disagree.
Well, Gisborne might disagree. They're falling into the sea for a completely different reason. But, you know, I think, you know, so again, you know, so that's something we need to be aware of. And the role of ComCom will be there to make sure that we're not rorting the system, that we're not building in levels of service which are exorbitantly high, gold-plated, to use the fancy terms. And so again, there'll be a much more in the background regulated environment. I suppose the front end of the system should enable us to apply that with a greater degree of flexibility than we have under the old DC model.
So how much, sorry.
Do you think it will increase though? From what it sounds like.
I think that they're probably going to be winners and losers, but it really, I think that depends on what the high levy areas are going to be. And as soon as we get the methodology, I think the best thing for us to do is do some case studies of it and what does that mean to us.
And so we're submitting on this, right? But we don't have, so we can't really, because one of my concerns is that if it increases, they're only going to pass that on to the homeowners, the people buying the houses. So it's going to just increase house costs for people here. And then the whole point is to increase supply of that. Like it's just that just doesn't work. You know, it's like you're trying to increase the growth, but people won't be able to afford it.
I think the DLs will technically be lower because of the separation from free waters.
Our deal. Add them together.
But equally, you know, if your rates are going up to cover those costs, yes, they go over some more people, but people are always paying for it. It's just whose pocket is it?
Yeah. Comes down to what we decide to deliver.
Yeah, I mean, there's that graph in the annual plan, the long-term plan that shows, you know, the cost of growth and the amount of money we get from growth. There's that gap in between, which is which, you know, that quantifies how much growth isn't paying for growth. So, you know, if we are aiming for growth to pay for growth, that gap's got to be covered.
So what it would mean is that cost is fully paid for by the developer and those new homeowners and not existing ratepayers who aren't getting the benefit of the infrastructure.
Homeowners are like shelling out more. And then we're just changing our market again to like people that can't afford it.
Yeah, and I suppose another thing too for the community that we're going to do a massive education piece on is when you have, for instance, an IFFA levy, not realising that when you buy your property that your DL hasn't been paid and you will actually potentially be paying that off. So your rates with your deed will be quite significant. So I think potentially as a council we will have to really front that, so our community educated on what that means. Yeah, communication-wise, because it will come as a shock to lots because they're so used to it being paid, and then when you buy your house, and for a lot of people actually, when it being paid at that mortgage level is easier than paying it off every year.
Oh, so just for those of you who don't know how the DCs work now, at the moment it's paid for by the person who builds the house and it's paid once. So when you buy a house, it's paid. But what Anita's, or the section, it's paid on the land, and it's, you don't pay it ongoing, it's paid when it's developed. But I think what Anita's talking about is if you, instead of going through this process, go through an IFFA, which we're about to move to, what IFFAs do is they put in place a levy that essentially pays off the same cost over time by household. So the households would then be paying that levy If that's what you're saying?
Yeah.
Yeah.
On top of their rates.
On top of their rates.
Yeah.
So the householder is then not paying it as part of their upfront house price, but they're paying an ongoing levy in addition to their rates.
You can get a mixed model though, where
You can
part
get a
of it's
mixed model.
paid through a DC,
Yes.
part of it's paid through.
Even better. Split it 3 ways.
But you're right, there is a big risk that your average punter assumes that it's all been paid.
Yeah.
I mean, we do have instances now where DCs haven't been paid, and when we go to request them, people don't realise they haven't done their due diligence. Again, it's another reason for a lawyer to make sure that those
But
costs.
that information can all go onto the LIM, which would show
what
that there is an IFFA process in place and tell the client that's what's going to happen.
But Nicola, to your point, I think that, again, this is all part of that same overall model that wants to shift costs and shifting costs directly onto the marketplace. So if that's going to force prices to go up here, it'll force prices to go up everywhere.
But to the affordability piece, under the old model, when it was paid, it's paid at the end, and that could be a 10-year process. So if it's paid at the start, maybe we'll bring that property to the market sooner. The developer may want to get it done and get away from it quicker. The price will be the price. The developer makes it the longer it goes on, whereas the homeowner pays it regardless.
And the economic, and this debate happened, a few years ago, didn't it, around the inclusionary zoning, that the costs to developers of this nature have little impact on what the price of the property is in the market. The price in the market is what the market will pay. And we see that when affordable properties then get initially, supposedly, and then immediately get turned over for another $250,000 on top. So that argument, although it sort of makes logical sense, isn't what happens in the market. So because the market's so dependent on who's available to spend what. And we're seeing that change right now that international buyers are able to get back into the market, and that top end isn't, there wasn't a market for that there before, but now anything over 5 million,
Does this create incentives just for sprawl? Because if I'm paying the same development levies as I would if I was in the middle of town or at the end of town, I might as well develop in really difficult places and costly places because it doesn't really cost anymore.
You still need to be part of our levy area to pay that, otherwise you're in a fast track. What it might incentivise though is our infill, if that's where we'd like it, in the likes of Queenstown or Frampton, where their costs were, it may incentivise it elsewhere. So
but if the costs are generalised across the whole catchment, then to do infill or to do sprawl is the same cost. You might as well do sprawl, it's easier. And that's, I guess, some of the questions is what is this creating an incentive for?
So even under the current legislation, councils didn't have to charge DC. So, for example, where they wanted remote inner city redevelopment, they could actually say, this is our DC. There's a number of councils that do that, and then they say, actually, we're going to discount our DCs by 50% to stimulate investment into areas where we want to see investment stimulated.
Yeah.
But the issue where you're talking about sprawl, the issue is it is generally much cheaper to have new infrastructure built. So the cost of new infrastructure per 100 metres or per kilometre is cheaper in greenfields than it is to rebuild and intensify. So you need to intensify at a level that actually justifies the cost of the infrastructure renewals that you do. So, low-level intensification that triggers new services is very, very expensive. So
if there's no DCs, it's definitely not growth paying for growth.
That's right. Yeah. So that's part of the equation that going forward, and it's always been council will need to look at and say, if we want to do this, we want to incentivise that. How do we structure our charges to make that attractive to the market?
I mean, one point we talked about over lunch was, sort of the underuse of land, that's zoned for density. So, the new stuff that's happening at 3 parks in Wanaka is because that's all zoned for stuff that's 4 stories high. We're getting a little 1-story high stuff going there, but all the infrastructure and all the supplies and the stormwater will have been sized based on that density. So, how do we deal with that? Because we're paying up front for what's anticipated in the spatial structure regional plan. But there's nothing to say I can't just put a standalone dwelling on my 1 hectare site if that's what I choose to do.
You rate it as if it is a three-story house.
That would be, you'd only be able to,
Can you do that?
I don't
well,
know.
there
Yeah,
is,
you can legally
well,
do
there's that high court, that court case that was, but it will be interesting under a rates capping, you know, that would pose an interesting when those dissect, but there was that Auckland, the Auckland case that went to the High Court about charging for visitor accommodation, and they were actually successful.
Yeah.
So there is a way, but you need to have it backed up with evidence. So there is a way, and actually that's a project that Carrie's team and my team have on the box when Emily's back to look at.
But unless you made it a non-complying activity to go to one level, like if the planning rules allowed you to go low, you couldn't then go ahead and say, oh, we're naughty you, we're going to rate you for a three-storey building.
Or you could
So, I mean, that's essentially what the government's medium density zoning changes are all about, right? They're actually about requiring minimum levels of density that don't allow what John's outlining, that we go in much lower. Because we still have to basically, but it's a natural part of the development cycle, right? If you think about the longevity of a network, basically you optimise the network probably 30 years. Say if you're building pipes for 100 years, you're optimising your network at about year 35. So you've got excess capacity, you've got an optimal period, and then you've got a period of stress, and then you rebuild. So that's always going to be the way, because you can't just keep expanding your pipes incrementally.
Yeah.
You can.
But I guess we've just got to be like cognizant of what outcomes we're creating through this policy, in the same respect of, being prudent to what investments we make and being real about what it actually drives people to do in the same respect.
But presumably the way DCs and DLs work is that if the developer chooses to build 1 story or 3 stories, they've paid the same DC because the DC is based on what it costs to build the infrastructure. So infrastructure was built for being able to have 4-story buildings, but they only built 1 story. Their DC, they still paid for it.
Well, that's how a DEU works.
Yeah.
It's a DEU, but if you're calculating it on the actual building time,
Yes.
you can potentially get a very different outcome.
Yeah, so is that what they're proposing?
No, they're proposing something similar to what we already did. Like they've given examples like, say if you're a 1 bedroom and you're 0.33 of a unit, so they've.
Yeah, so in theory, we aren't paying for it. They did through the development contributions, and if they paid for something bigger than they ended up needing, it allows for additional growth that is yet to happen. Yeah, that would be much more concerning if the difference between what they built and what it was zoned for, we had to pay for because we increased the capacity, but that shouldn't be how it works.
Sure it was.
The sentiment was, whereas with like land value rates, was that if you zoned the area, say it was medium density, they'd be paying as if there was, the maximum capacity. So whatever they built was up to them. But if they're going to build a single bedroom house, they're having to be paying the same contributions if it was multi-story. So the incentive is to maximise the investment, and then you don't have any sort of discretion between what they do with the land. It's just a really objective way of looking at it.
And that's for rates.
And that's for rates.
Yeah.
That's land value versus capital.
Yes.
Yeah. It's not like we have much discretion, it sounds like, in terms of how we want to go with this. This is more of this is what's going to happen.
So Anita, what type of submissions are you contemplating making on this?
So, that's the question for you guys in terms of where we think they're, I guess, and for Liz, from a technical perspective, are there things that are valuable for us to submit on and what you think we should submit on? Or could this be one of those things where perhaps we just don't submit on?
Feels like it's. We don't want to leave Liz with no work.
But you could just run a bunch of questions where there's a lack of clarity.
Yeah, I think there's 3 things. At high level, we should probably support it because it makes sense to aggregate and cross-subsidise, and I think it's got lots of benefits. A concern is no methodology right now. How do we know it's going to be any good for us, given we do have nuances compared to a lot of areas around the country? And the third one is that interaction with the IFFF and a special purpose vehicle for third parties. I think that has the ability to kick out the benefits. I think we'll not get much back from that. I think that's the way the rest of the planning bill works with fast tracks and spatial planning, and it's one of those things we may have to accept, but it's still worth us identifying that as an example and a problem.
Do you anticipate that whether the other local authorities or developers or whomever are going to be making strident submissions different from that?
I bet they won't rewrite the third year reviews.
Right, so therefore there is some reason for us to submit to kind of provide some balance.
Yep. Yeah. And there is some detail that the DC team have, in terms of the actual administration, how it works. They have raised a few concerns.
Cool.
Do you see any issues with the regulator now that you have a regulator? You're not just like have to follow the act. Because when I kind of read that, I was like, that seems like a whole lot of extra work.
There's going to be a lot.
And it says it's trying to speed it up, but it seems like that will be time consuming to the process. Trying to speed up the development of land, but you have to like go through the regulator first before they pay the DL.
I think they're looking at our policy, aren't they? Is what they'll be regulating.
Yeah.
And possibly any sort of monitoring that we may need to do. I'm not sure we do what monitoring we do at the moment, and then that's probably something we're going to have to get on top of and start setting up. But I think it's something we've been wanting to do anyway, and never mind just for ComCom.
On whether they're actually being paid or not, or that they're meeting the right level.
I think at the moment we have a bit of a system where consent comes in, we issue a development contribution, it gets put to the side, eventually a developer comes in, asks for an invoice and it gets paid. But I'm not sure what else happens outside of that. That is the system. But in terms of, I think as well with remissions, we have remissions, special assessments. I think we look at them on a case-by-case basis. We agree or disagree that they'll use less water or waste or whatever it is, and they get given a special assessment or a remission based on that. But I'm not clear that we understand what the impact is on the fact that if we have just spent X amount of money on a pipe that was that big, but we've given everyone a bit of a remission here and there because their water usage was a little bit lower, it doesn't impact the fact that we spent all that money on the pipe to start with. I don't think we really keep an eye on that or know exactly what's happening. I could be wrong, and Dominic probably knows that better than me, but I'm not sure we have that handle.
I think just to answer the question about whether it's going to speed things up or not.
Sorry.
You go. Sorry. Whether it's going to speed things up or not. The regulator, I think the answer sort of really depends on what the regulator's going to do. And I think it's seen at the moment that it's got sort of three broad areas. One's monitoring the rates that are set to ensure that no one's overcharging and that there's no double dipping. Second is to deal with disputes, so to replace the current commissioner review process that exists, and so it really sort of depends, I think, where how they're going to administer those things and the extent to which they're going to participate actively in those things, and Commerce Commission's, if that's where it ends up and that's not finalised yet, is already spread pretty thinly, and the tendency, I think, is likely to be looking at whether the rates are fair or not, probably, rather than the dispute area, because it's not a high-risk area anyway. There aren't that many disputes. They tend to get settled through negotiation. So I think it's more likely to be at that front-end monitoring rates and the second limb of ensuring that there's no double dipping. I mean, that's a process now that occurs through the long-term plan and takes a long time to do. Whether a regulator is going to speed that up or not, there may be efficiencies in having them uniform across the country to some extent, but we just don't really know.
Although in terms of speeding it up through the LTP process, and we'll talk about this more in the LTP, I think the implication, so this comes in 1 year into our LTP. So I'm pretty sure that means that for our LTP, we will have to understand, we will have to have a DC policy and DL policy.
Yeah.
Because year 1 will be under the DC policy and years 2 to 10 will be under the new DL policy. So I'm not sure that that's been thought through in terms of these timeframes, unless they're anticipating that we do an LTP amendment after year 1, which seems kind of like we wouldn't want to do that.
You know it's coming, yeah.
Quentin, do you want to chip in?
Yeah, thanks. So just going back to that point about whether you charge people less because you've got, potential to use less. I mean, I think it's very clear that the development levy or development contributions component is effectively an availability charge. Doesn't matter whether you use it, and the rates component is how much you use charge. So I wouldn't go down. Yeah, I just wanted to highlight. I wouldn't go down the route of giving too much, leeway to people who are seeking to use less, because the availability is where the cost comes from. But I also think we've just got to be super careful about, I suppose, larger uses too. And I'm thinking things like commercial activities and hotels. And I know they're always slightly different and harder because, a single section, you've got a single credit. So it's easy to, but you don't know on a commercial section whether it's going to have a warehouse or a hotel. So it's much trickier.
You haven't mentioned much about the detail of the differentials and stuff. I'm sorry, I should have gone into it, but I haven't. So you're saying it's largely the same as the DC policy? They're not the ability to create different categories and to put different differentials on things? Is it?
I think they gave some examples. They've given examples, but they've said they're for illustration purposes only. Yeah. So that will be in the detail of the method.
That we haven't seen yet.
Yeah.
So I just wonder if we need to we need to be able to cater for our unique district and make sure that they don't limit us too much and prescribe too much around your categories and stuff. Would that be fair?
I think every DC policy basically ultimately has a schedule of special uses that it's built up over history basically. I'm not sure whether they might look to standardise that a little bit, but that's a common part of most DC policies.
Could we ask a question about that, like in terms of the details around what discretion we would have to work these things out? And I'm interested in the case law around the differentials, because we've obviously had the guy who does our DC policy come in and sort of, well, you can't really change this too much and you can't change that too much. And it's like, well, why are we only charging 0.3 for this? That doesn't necessarily make sense. I mean, a hotel washes sheets like every day, so, will we have discretion and does the case law that's been built up over the current legislation around DC, is that still going to apply, or will we have
I think we're going to get a whole new, I think all of that is
be out the window and
potentially, but I mean, equally, I also think we've had the development contributions policy now since 2002, 2004, can't remember, and it's old.
And we know it doesn't cover growth.
So if you look at the policy and how it's worked, you can see how it's been tweaked consistently. And I think this does give us a really good opportunity, depending on what comes out of that methodology, to have a really good look at it. Because one of the key concerns I think we've had as a team for a while is that most of the DC policy was based at a time when we had greenfield development and everyone was building 700 metre square sections and plonking one house on there, and everyone was irrigating and doing what they do. And most of our differentials for residential anyway are based around that. But now we're moving into more comprehensive developments and more apartments and smaller living environments and not having the same level of irrigation.
Hotels are more the same, more on a par with residential than they would think.
So all of that really needs to be kind of looked at as part of the new levy policy. And whilst I don't think anyone's looking forward to the extra work, I think it's probably a really useful process to get back into that detail.
What are you talking about?
Does this model still allow for PDAs or contributions like for developers to contribute the actual physical works to build parks. So
It's
those,
better in some ways. It's actually now got first mover developers, bespoke assessments. So we've been doing a lot of this work anyway, and it happens through developer agreements, and they happen all the time in the background. But now it's more enshrined, and from our reading so far, there's nothing in there that we thought, oh, that goes against things that we do now. It's more of a sort of bill-based way of doing. So
yeah, we think developer agreements will become more and more desirable potentially through the system.
Yeah.
And that's why internally we're looking at process. We've done a big audit. Yeah, we're doing looking at policy. So we're doing a lot in that space too. So I think that will hold us in good stead when this comes through.
Yeah, when John and I talked to Sam Stubbs and others, that he and his essentially consortium of developers, they're really keen to say if it makes it easier for the council and for us to get this thing built and the rest built, we're quite happy to build all of the infrastructure and provide it until some point in the future and to the standards required. So, and because money's not really the object there, they just want to get the thing. I mean, relatively it's small compared with what they're going to build. Very interesting.
and then it goes then back to basically having a comprehensive view of the future that says, actually, yes, you need to build this for you, but actually we need you to build this to make sure it services the whole.
Quite.
And there'll be credits and there'll be mechanisms for offsetting those costs, but it does continue to point back to comprehensive structure planning, master plans for key parts of the network, and a view that goes as wide as, well, we need these parks, these connections, these roads, and these pipes.
All of that.
All of that actually build communities, and then we layer that back to some of the other legislation we're talking about that are questions whether we can do that. So we just, I mean, it's a multi-headed moving feast.
So have you got enough submission wise then? Yeah. So that's a good segue then to IFFA.
it really is.
Yeah.
The Infrastructure Funding and Financing Amendment Bill is kind of all of your concerns that you've been echoing throughout the day may become a real thing. So the IFFA, as it currently stands in brief, is effectively like a funding relief tool for councils. It creates an alternative way of funding infrastructure that would typically be local authorities to fund off our balance sheets. So what would happen is someone, whoever it may be, would propose this alternative funding mechanism for the infrastructure. It would come to us as council, and we would have very broad and wide-reaching discretion around whether it's a proposal we wanted to support or not. Say we did, it would then advance through the minister, who would consult with a bunch of other relevant ministers and ultimately be approved by cabinet. On approval, a special purpose vehicle is formed. They raise the funding for this infrastructure. That infrastructure is then built, vested with us, and the repayment of that upfront funding is by way of levy on the land that benefits from the infrastructure. So that's the mechanism by which that infrastructure is delivered off balance sheet. It's been around since 2020, and there's only been 2 times it's been used. So the idea behind this amendment bill is to really increase uptake. Anecdotally, it's been difficult to access, and there's been a lot of costs involved in developing proposals. I'm not sure. I don't think that reigns true to why we haven't used it. But in practice, what they're proposing really shifts us away from being a funding mechanism to relieve balance sheet pressure for councils into a very broad infrastructure funding tool. So what I thought I could do today is answer any general questions you have around how it works, and then maybe just draw a couple of key things to your attention. I'm conscious it's the end of a long day.
My first is, I guess, could you walk us through an example of when a special purpose vehicle would be used? And one over the holidays, I think it was in Whitianga, my mum got a bill. Well, they're gonna upgrade their water system to be all connected by mains, and instead of people having septic tanks in their own rainwater, it's gonna cost X amount, and they're talking about how to fund that. Is that an example where suddenly there's an uplift in service because they're gonna connect up old systems and need a new specific thing? Or, okay, it sounds more complicated. Scrap that. It just gets out of your brain.
Do you want me to provide a couple of
hypothetical
or examples?
Walk me through it.
Sure. So despite the original legislation being primarily targeted at development, because it requires a lot of detailed analysis around understanding who your beneficiaries are, the financiers want confidence in the likelihood of that levy revenue being collected, it, at least on paper, lends itself to infrastructure that has a much broader beneficiary base from the outset. So an example might be if we wanted to build a new materials recovery facility for the district, but we were going to struggle to pay for those upfront costs ourselves. We could instead, by order of Cabinet, establish an SPV. That SPV would then raise third-party funding. That funding would then pay for the construction of that MRF. That MRF would then be vested in us. We'd operate and maintain it, but those upfront costs would be recovered from every landowner that receives a curbside collection. And that might be set over a period of 30 years.
With a levy bill, it's not rates. Is this?
I know, but
What would then happen, because council is the construct that has the systems to be able to go out and collect that money, we would also be the levy collection agent. So on your rates bill, you would have a levy order number and that levy amount. Which I think is fair enough in a scenario where we as council are choosing to use it to fund council infrastructure. One of the key changes is that because it becomes much broader in terms of access, we can access a SPV, we might still be the levy collection agent for something that we've had no say over whether it goes ahead or not. So over time, councils will have, I think, quite a complex revenue narrative. You've got your IFF levy stacks, and then your development levies, and then your targeted rates, and your water charges, and your annual general rates.
These ones have to be between 2 and 4, and these ones start at end.
So the concept being that, well, if you're a landowner, you do your due diligence and you decide if you want to buy this property with this levy order on it or whatever. But I think over time, it's going to become increasingly challenging for councils to manage their overall affordability lens as its ability to influence where and how infrastructure and the associated charges are set down.
Do you want to just go through the changes actually, Jessie, first? Because I think that will generate the things that we want the councillors to be thinking about. You've got 45 minutes.
Oh, 45 minutes?
Yeah.
So perhaps before Jessie does that, it's worthwhile recognising that when the IFF first came out, basically they wouldn't get out of bed for anything less than $100 million worth of investment. So we had to
say that again.
They wanted at least $100 million worth of investment.
Right.
So, and that was basically to be able to take that to the international debt market and find that. So probably wouldn't have coped with a couple of upgrades in Whitianga. In fact, we couldn't generate enough in the district to get them to be interested in us. So they had a CIP as it was then, we're interested, but we couldn't generate enough debt for them to be actually willing to do so. Obviously the charges actually are first, they have the equivalent charge like a rate, so they're guaranteed to be paid in the same way that we can guarantee rates are paid. And to Jessie's point, some of the original modelling would be, the developers would be not only using it to pay for our costs in terms of trunk infrastructure, they'd be using to recover the internal costs of actually delivering their development. So basically, they were always going to be a mixture of charges that went straight back to the developer, charges that the developer ultimately passed on to us that they would have done through DCs. But the key benefit of them was the ability to step beyond the LGFA framework. So basically, you're creating effectively debt in the marketplace.
And longer term debt.
Longer term debt in the marketplace, utilising people like, the China Infrastructure Bank or the China Construction Bank, or particularly some of the big Canadian pension funds, ACC at one stage, and New Zealand Super were key potential investors into the IFFA. And then the whole premise of it was about how well, when they built every IFA model, that they could help spread the denominator. So if they could spread, the wider they could spread it, the more the cost went down. So when Tauranga used it to basically establish its IFFA for its, which road was it? It was the motorway. They basically said, they haven't built because actually NZTA went from their section of the deal, but the IFFA was going to cover everybody in Tauranga City and Western Bay, I think, potentially, who potentially could use that road. Whether they ever drove it or not, they were all going to be charged. So roading's a very good one because everybody has access to that road, so you can define your beneficiary basis very loosely. Water's great, but more difficult because you can only charge the beneficiary base, the person who's actually connected to that water supply.
So can we use that for Edith Cavell Bridge?
You could use it for something like Edith Cavell, or CIP had a strong interest in stages 2 and 3 of the arterial because they said we can spread that very, very easily. So it works for some asset classes. It doesn't work for other asset classes, but it actually has been broadened now, I think, hasn't it? So it can take in a wider amount of assets into the model if that's where people choose to go.
Why did the government allow this when they're wanting us to stay between 2 and 4? What is the purpose of 2 and 4?
That's because they want us to do
It's not right. That, so it gives you a mechanism of continuing to deliver.
But it's still the cost to households. I mean, it's 2 and 4 not about cost to households. The cost of it's not the point.
They want developers to use this so that it.
So
let Jessie go through the changes because that'll touch on the motivations.
Mike's points just prompted me. The other thing about the IFFA in its current form is once that infrastructure is in place, that levy order then becomes due. So that's where it's quite different from a development contribution, and that we have to wait for the developers to then move and subdivide entitlement. So there was a lot more certainty of repayment if you used this mechanism. In terms of some of the key changes, I suppose the one I think that's really material for us as a council is currently, like I said, we are the endorser of a proposal, and in order for a minister to sign off on a proposal, it's a prerequisite that the council endorses. That is taken away. So our involvement as the responsible infrastructure authority or local authority is very much constrained. If it's infrastructure that will be vested with us, we must look at it only from the technical specifications of the infrastructure and our ability to fund the ongoing maintenance of the assets if it's to be vested in us. Provided those 2 tests can be met, we would be required to provide an endorsement. So the amount of discretion is very minimal. Mike also mentioned about potentially that Edith Cavell could have been a candidate under the existing, and I think probably still the proposed, it doesn't really provide for blended funding on a single asset. So say we opted to use the IFF or the Edith Cavell, if I've understood the legislation correctly, we couldn't uplift a FAR from NZTA for that because it's 2 separate, mixing the funding pools. Right. I actually think that still stands under the changes, but it might be that we could, at least under the new provisions, blend some funding for all the pipes that get attached to the bridge.
But Jessie, could we, notwithstanding the FAR element, which I sort of aren't really across, but if we said actually we've got a program of roading infrastructure upgrades that are across our network over the next 10 years, we want to fund the entire upgrade system through a IFFA, presumably we could use the IFFA to do that. It's not necessarily tied to a single asset, but if you had a program, you could potentially, because effectively it's simply it's a funding tool.
But what Jesse's saying
where you're getting your money from.
We couldn't then attract a farm.
But then we couldn't possibly get a farm.
Which means that our community would be paying 100% of that cost rather than the 51% or 49%.
They couldn't allow you to get a farm.
Yeah, it's odd, and it's only something I picked up with the revised drafting.
Right.
I always thought you could have multiple funding sources.
Maybe
in
we
a
could
stack.
ask about that, maybe we could we not push back on that?
I think part of I think about what's different to say the development levies before us. That was an exposure draft. This is an amendment bill. So at this point, we're not asking questions. If we're submitting, I think we need to get really clear on the points we're trying to make. This is our last shot at influencing this. Notwithstanding that, I'm trying to get some clarity ahead of any submission we might make. The other thing that the amendment bill is.
Sorry, in terms of we would be required to approve it, we would also be required to be the collection agent. In terms of your example before, so we might, so we have to endorse it if it passed those two tests, and then we have to collect it.
But for what it's worth, we can charge a collection fee. So
I don't think we can charge a fee high enough to overcome the horror of having on the street.
Yeah, so sorry, Jesse, just so that part hasn't changed, we're always the collection agent.
These are just standard questions. Is it government guaranteed? No. It doesn't carry a rating. Does it carry the same rating as the government?
No, it's private capital.
AA plus AAA or not?
That's for the market, I suppose, and that's where CIP have been so that they've largely only dealt with basically sovereign fund level debt. So, and I suspect that's what will continue to happen.
Right.
Because I suppose the trade-off with getting sovereign level debt is the fact because the charges are the equivalent of a rate, then they're guaranteed recovery of them. So there's
an implicit guarantee, but not an outright guarantee.
There's an implicit guarantee. I suppose partly what attracts sovereign level debt and sovereign level debt interest rates is the fact that our ability to recover that debt on their behalf is guaranteed.
Right. How much money have they raised? You said it's been only two projects. Power on the motorway and
there's three, isn't it? There's the Wellington wastewater treatment plant. There's the Tauranga one, which never got off the ground, and there was a very original one, which was Milldale, which was the sort of trial model, which was the Fulton Hogan development, where Fulton Hogan bought the land, did all the asset development works, basically got an IFFA off the ground, a trial IFFA to get that. And I think that one of the key attractions of that, which I think Jesse mentioned, was they had like a development ramp. So the council didn't only get its money as development occurred, they were on a ramp that no matter how fast development occurred, the council got its income share from the IFFA.
So this is essentially a private placement. It's not registered. It doesn't freely trade. It's not something that you would see out in the market that people have lots of demand for. You just go to Ontario Teachers, what have you, and say, do you want some?
Well, I think in the context, it was all cycled through CIP, so Crown Infrastructure Partners, or now the Infrastructure LIFCO. So they are effectively the vehicle through which all the users pass through, and they are the people placing the debt.
Okay.
And so basically that's why they're placing limited debt with the key sovereign agencies.
So NIFCO goes to the market.
So it's
TV would not.
It's not name plated or anything like that. It doesn't say on it. Let's imagine this. Queen Lakes District roadways. It doesn't have a name on it. All the investor notices say IFFA. Okay.
So could there be a case that say you get a fast track development comes along, they do all their infrastructure on site themselves, the roads, water, wastewater, it's all funded through one of these things. We have no control, I guess, in terms of perhaps consenting, although that might be, we might not have control of, because the stuff's not being vested in us.
it's going to be paid for and owned presumably by somebody, I don't know. Do we lose control of standards of what gets paid for?
So we would still set the infrastructure delivery standard, and we would that would normally be vested to us.
The asset would come to us.
The asset would
charge
be
for
vested.
it. What they're talking about is that can be forced on us to do that. That's the change of what I see.
Yes, so
what Jesse's describing, that's the big change.
Exactly, and the only two tests are, do the technical specifications comply with our networks, and can we afford to maintain and operate it? Possibly jumping around a little bit, but we're talking a bit about vested infrastructure. There is now a proposed provision where if the proposer that's planning to use this tool says, oh no, I won't vest that infrastructure with council, we'll just operate it ourselves. That's one of two ways that any affordability testing over the, I guess, institution of this levy, what am I trying to say here? If the proposer says, I'll operate the infrastructure, the minister does not need to consider long-term affordability. I think that creates a real potential tail-end risk for us if at some point they, as a provider, fall over or can no longer afford to invest to maintain standards, and then we're looking at something under we have an acquisition investing policy for 3 water schemes.
But it's not vested, then we can't be required to collect. They do have to do their own collection.
No, we would still
we still have to do it. Wow. So on the rates bill, it would be everything else. Then it would be
the levy order number. The levy.
Yeah, but the bottom line would still be look like we're charging.
Yeah. Or if we really wanted to try and create some separation, you could send it as a separate bill.
What is the standard term of their debt? Is it 5, 10, 20, 50 years?
30 to 50.
30 to
Although
50.
I imagine they might potentially mix that a bit depending on.
But generally it's matched to the asset, so it's not 13-year debt funding a 100-year.
Yeah, so the levy can go out to a period of 50 years.
Oh, good.
I think that is part of government's intent with pushing us towards this product rather than the debt that we have available, is that this is longer term debt. Theoretically, it's cheaper.
It's intergenerational.
Yeah, and it's intergenerational, so it's paid for over all of the users of the asset over the life of the asset, whereas that's not quite how it works when we fund something.
Right, so I have a Heath question. On my balance sheet, if I raise 100 million of 50-year debt, do I still have to carry 100 million or can I discount it? Oh, I can make a case I can discount it.
No, you depends on, depending on your carrying policies, but you'd still have to carry it as it was paid down. I would imagine. I'll be Catherine question.
Jesse, can I ask a question about what you were just saying about the, if a private developer doesn't want to vest it in us, even if they do want to vest it in us, those two tests, that second test about whether the ongoing maintenance is affordable, can we bring into that decision whether, you know, a bespoke solution in this area that builds a whole, let's use water because it's an easy example, even though it won't be us, you know, you build a whole new wastewater treatment plant here and a whole new, water supply system here that is more expensive to operate in the long term compared to if we expanded a centralised wastewater solution, for example. Can we use that to inform whether it meets that test or not?
That's a good question, and I'll need to go away and check, but my initial reader interpretation is that it's only our organisation's ability to fund that operation and maintenance. It's not a relative.
So you can't bring into that decision network design elements and network efficiency elements. Yeah, which is
it's critical.
Yeah.
So looking at what you've seen, what would you suggest we submit on if there are?
So I think, let me just touch on a couple more things. I mentioned affordability and effectively a proposer being able to opt out if they're going to maintain and operate the assets themselves. The other one is, at the moment, the minister must consider the affordability of the levy in the context of total household charges. If the proposer now says they're willing to waive the right to that test and any purchases of that land at the time of the levy being established also waive that, then there's no requirement for the minister to consider affordability. So the only person making a decision about whether this levy is affordable in the long term is the proposer of the levy.
So the developer.
The developer. And anyone that might have a sale and purchase agreement.
So that does become a sort of interesting shift, and we've touched on that, you've touched on that a couple of times, and that is that it's shifting the level of sophistication of the public buying market. So like we've had, life's very simple, right? The DC gets paid, you pay for your house. What you're entering into with these different models is potentially more complexity in, have I got this levy? Has this levy been paid? What am I up for? Have I got 5 years to run on this levy, or have I got 25 years to run on this levy? So it will require a shift of maturity in the way that people buy and sell property, which I think is a big learning curve for New Zealanders.
And you could end up with multiple levies.
Yeah.
So, I mean, these are totally hypothetical example. You could live if you buy a property in Ladies Mile, and there could be an IFFA that built all the required roading and water solutions for that new development. Alongside when that development was being built, you might have an infrastructure company who wants to build, I don't know, like a gondola, and they also fund that project via an IFFA, which which is a district-wide levy because it's available to everybody in the district. And so actually as a householder there, you've got your rates, but you might have two IFFA levies, and so let's say one of them, the gondola one, just hypothetically, might they don't vest those assets in council because they're not council services. They run those assets indefinitely, so they didn't have to do an affordability test. And, when you're developing when there might be only, two major developers who are developing Ladies Mile, who at the time they do the IFFA, don't have any sale and purchase agreements, and they both agree to waive the affordability test. So no affordability test has been done on that.
Although in that example, only because we are an existing landowner, so the gondola will go on some of our land. So if you go by that, what GC was saying, we might.
Sorry, that's it. It's a hypothetical thing, right? So you've got rates, you've got two levies, and
Careful, this is about. If someone can't come along and simply decide to build something and then find a way to recover it from somebody else. Has to be some nexus between.
Absolutely not. No, absolutely. But both of those examples are things that could happen.
Potentially they could. Yeah.
And then worse too, you have to pay every time you use it. So as a ratepayer, you could be paying two levies and
Yeah. So I was just worried I decided to build a hotel and I thought I would charge it across everybody in the district.
So when we get to looking at the LTP and the 30-year investment program coming out of the spatial plan, some of these things are things that we'll need to consider for our own investments as well, because we'll have rates capping, and we'll say, and that might indicate that we can't develop things when we want to. So we might want to do an IFFA for something.
But we just said that we will pass over we'll send off. That's where we're
Yeah.
But that's
sorry. Pass back to Jessie.
Yeah, I just saw Quentin put his hand up a while ago.
Quentin, have you got a question or a comment?
He's just stopped off.
When they're developing part of, they're developing a piece of infrastructure, but it needs to connect with the rest of ours, right? So let's say they wanted to, do their subdivision and they were going to do that via the SPV and the IFF. And of course, we've got our major treatment plants, which are all centralised, and we've got Southern Corridor that's going to be coming up and using that, but also we've got this new development that might use the IFF. Is there anything in there around preferences in terms of we've signalled, we've collected DCs from the Southern Corridor, but these guys come along, who gets preference? If there's a limited capacity for treatment.
Capacity for what?
Well, in the rest of so they might be, they're seeking to use the SPV for a particular, just for their subdivision infrastructure.
So you're talking about the scenario where they want to connect to our centralised, for example, wastewater.
And there is capacity, but there are also different parties competing for that capacity.
The IFFA is incredibly enabling of out-of-sequence development. So if they got up and running, they would be the ones that got capacity.
Does this create market uncertainty so that developers don't know whether they should take the risk to progress or not, especially under an old model, especially under the levy model. So would you not be?
They might possibly alter the IEP.
Oh, yeah, exactly. Is it?
Or they might want more certainty by pursuing a development agreement saying we'll build it and we'll work with you to
Well,
get it
that
paid
means
for.
does our development agreement, does that take preference? Because this is one from an establishes, is there any preference? No, you're saying no. Does there need to be, and could we submit to say there needs to be some sort of structure to give the market certainty? Because otherwise, people might bail. We can't have some sort of free-for-all. Who's the first to put their IFF thing proposal on the table and they're the ones that get it? That's not strategic. That doesn't align with our spatial plan. There must be a preference.
So I guess jumping ahead to submission points, but I do want to come back to a few other changes to bring to your attention. Yeah. If we are to submit, I would strongly recommend that any IFF proposal should be able to demonstrate clear alignment to regional spatial strategy or equivalent. At the moment, this just feels like the ticket to opting out of that. And that might help. Yeah. All of these things are happening individually, but have quite complex interactions. And I don't think we could overestimate the amount of thinking that's happened about that. I think it's happening quite quickly, and any advice we can provide around that would be quite helpful to those drafting the legislation.
But Jesse, just on terms of sort of the point that he's making, I mean, you know, we've traditionally, you know, we've basically effectively, as we've built infrastructure to meet demand capacity, you know, effectively we sort of ring fence that capacity, right? We don't absolutely do, but we generally dedicate it and say we have to meet that, because what we have to do is we have to be able to demonstrate if someone who had zoned land and we said we were servicing it and they turned up and said, okay, I'm ready to build, we need to be able to demonstrate within a reasonable time frame that we can deliver that servicing. So I think there's there should be a natural break that says actually a third party coming in that's outside of that area cannot simply steal that capacity effectively, because that's the opportunity cost, right? So to me, that's a case of saying that capacity has been allocated, and we often do I say it? No, that's right. We often do deals that say, actually, if you've got a short-term need and we know that the area that this has been allocated for has no intention to develop for another decade, we can actually basically do a deal that allows you short-term access to that until that demand, by which time you will have contributed the amount of money to build the demand that you're actually consuming. So we do a lot of time, and engineers do a lot of time shifting that, because nothing ever builds in the way we thought it was going to, and no developer ever operates in the way that they claim they were going to. So we're always doing that sort of deal. And 99% of the time, I think we get it right. Occasionally we get ourselves caught short, where we suddenly get a short-term deficit because someone's miscalculated or someone's come along a bit earlier than they anticipated. Alice is a good example. He'll say, no, I'm going to develop, and suddenly decide he's going to, and suddenly we have to scramble to accommodate him. But that's just reality. So I think that is the basic model. It's not about stealing capacity. It's about making sure that we're protecting the capacity we've committed elsewhere, but ensuring that if someone else comes along to demand new capacity, there's a process for that new capacity to be added. It might be managed in the short term differently, but ultimately it does get added to the net capacity of the network.
Yeah, it's just making sure there's a...
So does this give the ability to do that, Jesse?
So I'd like to check my interpretation with the lawyers.
Cool.
I absolutely expect that network, I guess, receiving capacity would be a feature of a technical evaluation. To what extent any commitment of that capacity to a particular party would need to be enshrined in some kind of legally binding document to enable us to count it as used capacity. That would be something I'd like to check.
But there's some fundamental stuff here, isn't there? So we've got pressure from the government with their reforms to have enabling planning, it's a term used, although the rushed nature of the planning that we're having to do now means that it's not really planning much at all. Not really, because planning takes time and consideration. And then we've got the IFFA and the special purpose That's a useful tool to have, to be able to fund things that we need to do in a logical framework of planning, which there's some freedom of movement, some things might happen sooner. But when an entity, a private entity, can enter into an IFFA and without, it meets the technical standards, but otherwise the affordability and all of the other commitments we have, we are then required, with no consent, with hardly any ability to even discuss it, have imposed on us the requirement to then put a levy on property owners, just seems entirely inappropriate. It's not planning, it's not, and it's an imposition on us and with significant amount of risk that we have no involvement in managing that risk. I think we need to push back on this very strongly, that aspect of it. Otherwise, having the funding mechanism is great. Sure, it's got to be in a managed environment that we can manage the risk. At the moment, if your interpretation's right, and I tend to expect it is, this could be horrendous for us.
So I think just the context that comes back to Jesse's point about, so there are fundamental steps in this, right? So ultimately, at the end of the day, the IFFA is ultimately probably the last step. It's the step that says, how are you going to fund this?
Yeah.
So there will be and should be, and let's hope there is, it should be consistent with the spatial plan, because that's the first order that the government through its RMA changes have had.
But if this is attached to a fast track?
Well, the fast track is the devil in the detail, right? Because the fast track says you must accommodate a fast track that's outside, you must be flexible around the outside of that. And a fast track that then uses an IFFA model as a way to actually fundamentally shift the dial. So that's, I think, as a funding tool, it's useful, but connected to a fast track, it's potentially quite disruptive. But if it's a funding tool that enables, a pianist now, I feel like. It's a funding tool that enables what our planned strategy.
You're just a monkey, you're the organ grinder.
Thanks.
Carry on.
Peanuts? It's actually a potentially, it's just another tool in the toolbox to get development underway.
That's right.
I think the point to make is, our water services CCO is going to have regulatory, guardrails, direction imposed on it over best value provision of infrastructure, and before we can collect money on that. And what we're hearing is that might not apply to anything else that comes through one of those. That's that contrast of because that's not about getting growth done. Well, it's about getting growth done, but not necessarily affordable growth. So I think that's it. But I mean, if it's a bill, it's probably too late. But I mean, it's an obvious discrepancy. It's a double standard that we may have to charge householders, for stuff that we wouldn't be able to charge for if we'd done it ourselves.
Yeah. Is it going to select committee, or is it?
Yeah.
It is.
It's at select committee. That's what this consultation is. Consultation on bills is usually done through a select committee. Yeah.
So,
mind you, these are all at various stages with weird consultation processes, so we need to, I think this one is with the select committee though. I think it's been actually with the select committee for some time and only just been released.
Yeah, there was a kind of a flurry of activity maybe around 6 months ago, and then it went dead quiet, and it's popped up over Christmas.
Yeah.
I guess I feel like it would be remiss if I didn't also flag to you in practice eligibility to access this tool is much broader. So NZTA will be able to access it, new water organisations will be able to, hold that thought, and other state-owned enterprises like Kiwi Rail, Powerco's. So there's a lot of things that landowners don't expect to pay for now through a rate type model, right? NZTA.
It's called taxes.
Yeah, exactly.
So we might find that there would have been infrastructure that would have been funded through traditional NLTP type routes that actually is instead funded through a levy. So actually we start to see that stack build up over time.
Which is totally inequitable because taxes.
So although NZTA would argue that doesn't make it an equitable because they're not collecting enough through the collection mechanism they have, which is all the road-based user charges, petrol, taxes, etc., to fund what is required under the NLTP. That's why they're making all of those other changes to their funding model. So, yeah. But
levies has been opened to NZTA, is that correct?
I think it has.
Yeah,
I was thinking that before.
I checked, no, I think it's only the IFFA.
In this way, people who ride bicycles all the time would end up paying for the roads.
So the concept is you can opt into this if you want when you're buying a house,
Yes.
right? You always have a choice, but I think in the long run it will create some challenges around realising the spatial plan outcomes.
It's not just buying a house like NZTA do, NZTA build houses.
They would still, because they would have a wide range of affected landowners, the minister would be obligated to consider affordability.
Sorry, Jessie, so in a case like NZTA or in network infrastructure, the levy would go only to new households, or would it go to existing households?
Any beneficiaries.
Yeah, so it could actually go to existing households, so it's not just about buying your house.
Yeah, so the thing is though, if you're an existing household, you at least have some protections around that affordability test.
But if we wanted to spend $250 million on a roundabout improvement, we would have to have huge engagement, mandates to do that. How do NZTA do that when they want to build the next junction upgrade?
We just start sending them a levy bill.
Well, but I don't know, there's probably no answer, I'm just...
But it's quite a good example. If they chose to fund that through the Infrastructure Funding and Financing Act, they wouldn't necessarily be obliged to consult. They might have their own organisational policies that trigger that. But in that scenario, the minister would have to consider the affordability of that levy.
But then you have to ask, I suppose we do run the risk of drawing too many bows, because, like you would then say, if that part of the state highway network is actually something that should be charged across the whole of New Zealand, because not the Wakatipu Basin, not the district, not the sub-region, but actually it's a New Zealand state highway, so it should be charged.
So limits.
So effectively it becomes another default version of tax. So I think I suppose what we just need to think about, and it'd be useful as Jessie looks through this, is what are some of the probabilities as opposed to the possibilities as opposed to the theoretical possibilities.
Yeah. So based on the current design, the probability of anyone using it is slim to none, as demonstrated by no one using it. But actually, I think Jessie, maybe there have been changes that they're making, the proposed changes in the bill that make it a lot easier to access. So that might increase the probability, question mark?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, we've already got developers who are now being encouraged to use a tool like the IFF to fund their enabling infrastructure. So we are dealing in possibilities though. Yeah. I guess maybe just on a positive note, if we chose to pursue the IFF to fund some council infrastructure off balance sheet, the process of developing and getting that approved would be much more streamlined under this new legislation. At the moment, the minister has a range of tests he needs to satisfy, and he must consult with a range of other ministers. Those things wouldn't necessarily be in place anymore. So, and also the amount of detail you need to put into a levy proposal would be reduced significantly. So that's at this stage about the only upside I can find. But that's kind of IFFA amendment in a nutshell.
But I'll come back to Steve, but are there examples of things that we might use this for? I mean, given that it's a 50-year lens, so, and there's big cash, benefits in that period of lending, and especially if we're up against debt headroom, or we don't want to increase debt through that. Are there things that spring to mind?
In terms of the period of lending, possibly not. LGFA are already a little bit irritated that councils don't take longer lending terms with them. So we do have those kind of options available already. In terms of removing that risk of recovering the funding, certainly there's a benefit. often that under recovery of growth is because we anticipated that demand to come online in a certain place and it didn't. However, I think development levies might help offset that somewhat.
Because when you have an IFF for something, you probably wouldn't have development levies as well. So you don't have that lag that we're having to manage at the moment.
You absolutely cannot double dip.
Yeah.
And it will be more expensive than LGF.
Yeah, it will be more expensive.
It will always be more expensive.
Yeah. Although I get this is just hearsay. I have heard they're looking at mechanisms of the government actually providing some or all of the funding, and once they've got critical mass, rolling that up into a bond. So that might actually be able to attract some lower rates than the offshore or even local private financiers could offer. Otherwise, I think probably it's going to be more useful for the water services CCO than potentially for council based on what your revised potential rate profile looks like.
But there will be something that we would look at during the LTP process, depending on what our proposed program looks like. Tony Pickard's got great visions for transport for the future, that parts of which might lend itself to IFFA, but that needs to be flushed out once we know how the target band for rates is going to actually be calculated.
How much does IFFA, which is also known as NIFF, right?
Different. So NIFF is the National Infrastructure Funding and Financing Company. They are effectively like the shop front for the IFFA. So they're the ones that will go and raise the money and help you build the proposal.
So what's our interaction with them? Email, or do they come here and visit, or do we go to Wellington?
Historically,
where's the
we've had a number of
face-to-face take place?
sessions.
All right.
Yeah, they're very interested in getting something working here. The amendments are not necessary for that to happen.
They're the ones who've been approaching developers as well, having direct conversations with developers.
Wow, that sort of marketing. Why do they want it so?
Because otherwise they'll be disestablished. If they don't have any, if they can't prove the work for them, they will be disestablished.
Well, their role is to facilitate the delivery of infrastructure to enable housing development so that we can get affordable housing. So
they're very closely related to, so you've got the National Infrastructure Plan.
Yeah.
You've got the National Infrastructure Plan priority list.
Yeah.
NIFCO are a tool.
Yeah.
That is effectively a quasi-government tool to basically help make sure that to help fund that delivery.
And they work alongside the Infrastructure Commission, who is also working alongside central government, local government, developers, looking at that long-term pipeline of infrastructure needed to build, to support the growth and development that we need across the country. And so they work alongside each other. So I think they target areas where the Infrastructure Commission is that are prioritised within their plans and are aligned with their national infrastructure plan.
So on behalf of the infrastructure team, you see, so we've got an infrastructure deficit, obviously. Do you guys think it's a good idea? And on hearing that it's a sidestep of getting around rates rises, because it's just passing on a rate in a different name, do you guys as a team think will be a useful tool that we can use to bridge that infrastructure deficit? And is it fair on the property owners long term, do you think? Or does the team think?
So I can't answer on what the team thinks because we haven't had a conversation about it yet. I'm sure we'll talk about it at our leadership team meeting this week. I personally think that IFF as a construct and as a tool can be very helpful for us, and I think it can be applied very fairly. I don't see how the amendment bill would benefit us. And actually, the time and cost associated with putting together a proposal might not be the worst thing. It really forces you to kick the tyres on it and stress test whether actually the levy is affordable in the long run. So with this, I'm not sure if the benefits of a streamlined process outweigh the due diligence that it would trigger us to do now.
Can I just confirm that, I thought you said earlier that if you can't use it and get NZTA subsidy for transport projects?
You can't blend funding on a specific asset
But what we could do, say we were building a road, is we could use something, this is a cruddy example, sorry, we could use something like the IFF to fund the stormwater infrastructure on either side, and then the road itself, we could attract a FAR and fund with development contributions.
Okay.
But I'll check it when I check a few other points with the legal team. My interpretation is that you can't blend funding on a specific asset.
Thank you, sorry.
I think that's probably to protect from risk of double dipping. It might be quite difficult to determine where the benefit starts and stops in terms of how you ultimately shed that cost home to various people that pay for it.
Okay.
I just quickly, just to Mike's point before, I just want to make sure, can we submit along the lines of, it shouldn't be used to get around the lack of government funding so that ratepayers are paying for stuff that should have been paid for by taxpayers. Just with the NZTA thing, and you effectively made that point
before. Well, I think
the
point that Jessie made about the fact that other government departments may now be eligible for it does sort of, at least at one level, raise the spectre that this is an additional funding tool beyond their tax, their government tax sort of allocation.
I think we need to be aware that that is a purposeful policy choice the government has made, because they can't collect enough tax across the whole system to pay for the infrastructure they are responsible for paying for. So they're having the same problem that we are, which is why they're adding it to a
very
tool.
clearly, because it's
As a tool in
election
their
year,
toolbox.
and we actually do need to make sure people are clear. I mean, ratepayers, I can just see them, if this becomes a popular thing, government agencies start using it. The list of fees on the rates bill and what does affordable look like? I mean, effectively they should have raised taxes and be collecting it in that space, but instead they're rating properties. It's so inequitable. In terms of where the money is made, in terms of...
I think their argument would probably be they are, instead of raising taxes generally and everybody paying for it, they are putting the cost on the beneficiaries of the thing that's being built. Because it's a beneficiary-based process.
Basically, core government assets.
I'm not agreeing with
it. The beneficiary base needs to be spread incredibly widely, at which point taxation is the most efficient form of gathering it.
And people pass through, people are driving through this place. I mean, the NZTA starts, that's not right. I mean, that's definitely, without a visitor levy. I mean,
we're talking hypothetical or something.
We are.
We're not doing that. I think for a new subdivision where property owners are going in subsequent to that know that there's a levy attached to the rates bill, don't potentially have as much of an issue with that. They're backloading the national highway network. But I don't think it'll be used for that anyway, would it?
I just want to, I don't want people to go away thinking it wouldn't be, particularly because we have a huge transport issue and deficit, the majority of which sits in the state highway network, which we are having discussions about through the revision of the strategic network plan that's NZTA are doing. It's part of the regional deal discussions, and the size of that program well exceeds the government's ability to fund it and our ability to fund it.
But they also don't have an alternative state highway that goes past the town. If they're saying that it's out.
Some of this NZTA funding will be covered in the meeting on Wednesday.
Wednesday's meeting will be, or that meeting where you're talking about NZTA funding, that's more talking about the NLTP, RLTP and the allocation of the FAR and those kind of things, isn't it? Okay. If I'm thinking about the right meeting.
Meeting on Wednesday.
Thursday.
Oh, sorry, that's Thursday.
Penny, how does this all relate to the regional deal? Because I feel like they're steering us towards this is your solution for the regional deal.
It's not a deal, is it?
So the regional deal in relation to transport, which is the most relevant part here, what we are wanting to do with government is to, in partnership, have an agreed understanding of what the transport solutions are that we need as a district, and then how they fall across central government and local government and how they'll be funded with a package of funding solutions. IFFA might be one of those. They might be used by them, it might be used by them, it might be used by us. There'll be other tools in there as well. So it may well lead through into our LTP discussions about rates. There'll be discussions about road user, user-based charges, tolling. There's a wide variety of tools, and IFFA is one of them. And from the beginning in the proposal, the discussion has been how do you use the best combination of those tools to get the things that we need delivered, because we haven't been able to deliver them under our current model, and NZTA has not been able to deliver them under their existing model.
I think by way of context, there hasn't been discussion, as far as I'm aware, amongst the politicians of what then look like.
Yeah.
And then being whether it's a new river crossing.
No. That work
bus lanes or.
So what those projects are has not.
No.
It's not even in pencil on a piece of paper that we're looking at. That process is still in train for sure, but that's what the deal itself is likely to be, a commitment to us continuing to work towards that. But it will need a combination of funding and financing tools to deliver all the things we need. And IFFA will be one of the tools considered.
But that's only because we're getting constraints on our, original initial funding model. This is no different. It's still the rate, it's still the households that are paying. So when do we stop thinking about what we can do? Stop thinking about us as a council. We are the ratepayers. And what's the best thing for the ratepayers? And when we make submissions, we have to be submitting on behalf of the ratepayers, not the council. We're not an entity, we're not our own thing. We are, it really annoys me when we start to go, we can't, ultimately, this is just putting more cost on households.
I share the sentiment in the same respect of, a lot of these costs, trying to always think about it like people are so much more nomadic nowadays. There's far more visitor aspects. Thinking that everybody uses the services have to live there is a little bit outdated. And in the same respect, I think it's good to come back to that principle of, how's this going to benefit our community? It's just going to create more exposure and risk without any benefits.
And more confusion as well, more frustration.
Just benefits, and we've seen that with Freedom Camp. But you're saying the government can't fund it. They've chosen not to fund it.
Of course they've chosen.
They've chosen to take regional land transport, local transport funding, and shift it to roads of national interest. So therefore, and now they're loading all the cost of that
onto our people.
On local, and so that's something we need to talk about on Thursday. Thank you for setting the scene.
I bet you've been looking forward to today for weeks. Well done.
Well, I hope you're looking forward to the LGP discussions. To work out what it's actually going to cost.
I'm mindful of the time and other people's time, so I'm sure there'll be some chats after we close the workshop. If people want to chat, but thank you for your participation today, and we'll close the workshop.
Thank you. So the actual submissions will be emailed to you for your comment base.